The story begins with a boy approaching a girl named Espen and saying that he wants to tell her something. A boy stood before her, holding a bouquet of flowers. Despite his shyness, he asked Espen if she would marry him. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment, realizing she'd been expecting anyone but him. This wasn't supposed to happen in the future. In turn, the guy looked at her with puppy eyes and said that he really liked her. At that moment, Espen turned her head away sharply, saying that she didn't want this. The guy approached her, perplexed, and with tears in his eyes asked why. He didn't meet anyone but her. Well, this cute and sweet boy, who is standing in front of our heroine right now, will be the strongest man in the Empire in the future. People will call him the Devil Sword Master, and he will also become the man she will hate more than anything in the world. That's why Espen had such hatred towards him. And that's why she pushed him right now and refused him again. The strong push even caused the bouquet of flowers he was holding to fall out of the guy's hands. But the girl turned around and, saying, "I have to go," began to move away. Our heroine herself understood that she should not have helped the boy who would become her sworn enemy in the future. Shortly after Espen ran away, an explosion of incredible proportions occurred right behind her. She certainly had no intention of stopping, but she suspected she had already lost her mind. She needed to leave the city as soon as possible. Turning around to check if everything was okay, our heroine, to her horror, realized that everything was not as she would have liked, because that creepy guy was behind her. Immediately after his appearance, another guy appeared, floating in the air. This was the second person our heroine had to be wary of. The girl turned around, and the guy told her that he would help her, so she shouldn't worry. Coming even closer, he took her hands and said that in that case, she would have to choose him instead of that guy. Everything was so confusing and unclear that our heroine was simply stunned at this point. Now let's figure out what's going on. On the left, a boy who will be considered the strongest in the Empire. He will become the youngest leader of the Knightly Order. On the right, a future great mage. In turn, our heroine, Espen, is something of a time traveler who completely accidentally got mixed up with these two. But what happened anyway? The Celestial Knightly Order. It is undoubtedly the most powerful force in the Empire. Only talented knights and wizards can join it, and each candidate is carefully assessed based on their achievements. Age, gender, status. None of this mattered, because the main thing was ability. The Order is a place that almost every resident of the Empire wants to join, and all because, once you get there, you automatically become an object of envy and honor. 10 selected candidates from this order were named Royal Knights. Currently, the head of the Knightly Order is a man who has been dubbed the strongest man in the Empire. Of course, we're talking about the guy we already know, who at that point was already a high-ranking commander in the Heavenly Knightly Order. This is Zinok Ivan Blacknight. He is one of the 3 dukes of the Empire, as well as the youngest commander-in-chief. Our heroine, in turn, was no less popular among the knights. She was the vice commander of the Heavenly Knightly Order, Espen Shua. Our heroine is an orphan with a huge scar on her face. She's not considered a superior. Everyone around her hates her. Our heroine simply couldn't spread her wings while trapped in the commander's shadow. Even she called herself a loser and hated Zenok with all her heart. After a while, a conflict broke out in one of the offices. Espen, perplexed, slammed the table and asked why this was happening, leading the front row at the ceremony. That's her role. The man scratched his head in surprise and said that, as he was told, everyone simply decided to change. Espen still said that they were competing for the leading role at the ceremony, and she deservedly won. Nevertheless, the man glanced at her and asked if she really expected anything with that look. Zenok would have been a better fit for the role, since at least he didn't have a scar. The man said that this scar couldn't even be hidden with magic. Espen shouted in bewilderment. I told her she could wear a mask. However, he didn't even want to listen to her. He explained to her that their task was to preserve the dignity of the royal family. The decision had already been made, and there was no turning back, so Lady Shua was free. Clenching her fist tightly, the girl said that, in that case, she would talk to him personally. I certainly didn't want to hate the day, but it seemed like everything around me was calling for that. As soon as the girl left the office, she couldn't come to her senses for a long time. She kept muttering something to herself with a dissatisfied face. On her way, she encountered Divan Chair. He approached the vice commander, saying he'd heard she'd lost her place at the ceremony. But why? She'd earned it. However, he then sighed and said that if Commander Zenok replaced her, it would be for the best. The girl guiltily lowered her gaze and did not even dare to say anything in response. As a child, our heroine lost everything in a fire: her loved ones, her home, all her belongings. The culprit was never found. Soon after, she discovered she had incredible swordsmanship. Had she been recognized then, perhaps people would have treated her differently. Even though she had talent and was superior to many other knights, she was unable to achieve more because of this man. Zenok! This is the most impenetrable wall for the royal knights. She hates him and longed for the chance to never meet him. However, that wasn't the only problem. Even in the competitions they entered, he usually won. Looking at him, she couldn't understand why he was so flawless. This was what drove her to despair. Either way, she didn't want to live her life feeling inadequate. The idea that one could join a heavenly knightly order based on one's abilities slowly faded into the past. Aristocrats increasingly gained more power. Now it was only a matter of time before this place completely rotted away. The girl understood that after all this, the disdain towards her would only intensify, which meant it was time to leave. The saddest thing for Espen was that she had no family or home. Lately, she often wondered about the meaning of life. Nevertheless, before she died, she wanted to defeat this monster at least once. Or rather, before leaving here, she asked the commander to fight her, and this was her last request. Looking into his eyes, she realized she didn't particularly care about winning or losing. She knew for sure she would end this man she hated. At that moment, a surprised Zenok approached Espen and asked if she was serious. The girl didn't understand whether he had to speak to her like that, being so close. Anyway, she said she was serious, and after receiving a positive answer, the commander told her that he would be waiting for her at the training camp. Our heroine exhaled heavily and hurried out of the room. The guy watched her and, perplexed, merely remarked that her head was a complete mess. After some time, the action takes us to the street, where, at that moment, it suddenly started to rain. While preparing for the duel, Zenok suggested to the girl that they postpone their duel, as he really didn't want her to be upset by losing because of her victory. Nevertheless, our heroine pointed to the time and said that, as always, he had arrived on time. The girl sighed and told him that everything was fine. Looking confidently into his eyes, she told him that she was certainly not one of those people who didn't like the rain. Zenok said that was very good. Soon after, he took off and raced towards Espen at lightning speed. Our heroine assumed that he would attack so cunningly, so she managed to dodge his attack in time. She needed to focus on the commander's hand movements, and then she would be able to resist him. At that very moment, he began to swing again, but Espen caught him and lunged towards him. Soon the blade was at his neck, so she told him that he had fallen for her trick. However, it is unclear how a devastating blow passed through her body and pierced her skin. Of course, the girl reflexively jumped to the side because the pain was intense. Zenok looked at her as raindrops washed his face, and he begged Espen to admit defeat. Our heroine was trying to even out her breathing right now, thinking that she needed to calm down. She was so close. Biting her lip, she nevertheless began to rise again. Today was her last chance. The strategy was the same, so anything was possible. She would succeed in defeating the commander. The most important thing in her case was to find the perfect moment. Our heroine turned to him at that moment and said that he always came like clockwork. The girl even said that this was precisely what she liked about him. She respected him, and only now did she begin to understand that she had developed an inferiority complex because many people around her simply hated her. It probably wasn't his fault, but nothing has changed since then. She likes the idea that she won't pick up a sword again, because this is her last battle. While watching Espen's attacks, the commander always noticed that the first attack was always a horizontal cut. He also always noticed that her gaze was literally endlessly focused on his hand. And besides, she continued to swing at him with all her strength. At that very moment, a very bright light appeared behind Espen, which even began to blind Zenok. Thanks to this, the girl was able to take advantage of this moment and still began to attack him. Soon there was a huge explosion that began to spread in different directions. At that very moment, Zenok collapsed to the ground. He immediately began to recall the beginning of the battle and why they had begun at 5 o'clock and fought despite the weather. Seeing the dawn, he understood that she had certainly not chosen this particular time at random. Wiping the raindrops from her face, the girl asked the commander if the weather had influenced the outcome of the battle. Hadn't it? As a result, Espen Shua has 99 losses out of 100 duels, but now has one coveted victory. The action soon shifts to evening. The girl was walking through the evening city, thinking about how, for some reason, she didn't want to go and treat her wounds. She understood that she could even die like that, but she didn't particularly care. Wait, is that a rabbit? Right at that moment, a cart appeared out of nowhere and rushed at full speed towards the harmless animal. Our heroine rushed forward in horror, thinking that it was dangerous and it seemed like it was already too late, but she still didn't want to leave this poor rabbit in trouble. Of course, the driver who was driving the cart noticed the girl running out onto the solid line too late, but he still began to stop the cart with all his might. The girl fell to the ground one way or another, but the last thing she did was wrap her arms around the rabbit. The guy jumped up in confusion and asked if she was dead. What should he do in this situation? Soon, he finally climbed back into the cart and headed off. Espen couldn't even do anything because she'd expended all her energy. The girl decided that she would die alone. Fortunately, she ended her knightly career with victory, but her life proved too short. Then she didn't even think that she would be given another life, and that she would again meet the man whom she hated with all her soul, and in exactly this guise. After some time, the girl lay on the grass, not understanding why her body hurt so much. Immediately, a picture appeared in her head of herself running after a rabbit and soon being hit by a carriage. Starting to rise, albeit with difficulty, she still tried to understand what kind of place this was. Espen raised her head and noticed only trees and a lake around her, which was illuminated by the moonlight. It was quite surprising, because she felt like she was already dead. Incidentally, she felt how dry her throat was. At that moment, she decided to get up and go to the water to take at least a sip of water, but suddenly the girl noticed her reflection. She immediately screamed in confusion, because it wasn't just her face that had changed, her body had changed too. Espen couldn't understand what was happening. Her previously trained body, which is the property of a knight, where did it go? She fell to the ground in bewilderment, not even understanding why her body was so loose. Soon she heard a strange rustling sound, so she raised her head and noticed a strange creature in front of her, who joyfully told our heroine that she had finally come to her senses. Of course, the first thing our heroine asked was who he was and why he was talking to her. The sweet rabbit said he was the deity of fate, Lepus. He also decided to mention that she might not thank him for saving her. Our heroine paused. She immediately remembered the rabbit she'd rescued from under the carriage wheels. Could it really be him? After all, at that moment, she didn't really understand what was happening around her, so she took him for an ordinary animal. Yet, now looking at him, she realized that this was not at all an ordinary rabbit, as she had thought. Approaching him, she asked what help he was talking about. Did he really mean that he helped her by turning her into this? Lepus said everything was correct. The girl immediately began hugging him and asking, perplexed, what he had done with her body. The rabbit was perplexed by the child standing before him being so hot-tempered. He told her that she had died on the road, and he had saved her by giving her a new body. Espen was in complete shock. At that moment, she felt like life had no meaning at all. Right now, tears were streaming down her face, and she was wondering what this feeling was that was overwhelming her right now. Did he really help her because she helped him? Lepus told her that Espen was destined to die that day. She would have died anyway if she hadn't met him, but he'd taken a liking to her and decided to give her a new body. However, he also added that this body is temporary and will disappear once his powers are over. Lepus asked the girl if she wanted to live. Espen told him she did, because if she died once, she realized she'd been wrong. She promised herself that from now on, she wanted to throw away all bad thoughts and live her life happily. In that case, this cute creature jumped up and told the girl that in that case they should make a contract with her. In fact, her current body was under the control of a deity of a different level. One day, due to a rift between dimensions, the divine beings escaped. If she agrees to help him find all the creatures that left the time zone, then he will allow her to live on. Our heroine asked what time zone they were talking about. Lepus replied that it would be difficult to explain all the details, but they were currently in the Empire 18 years before her death. Espen screamed in bewilderment and asked if she had really returned to the past. Lepus nevertheless told her that in order to save him, she threw herself under the wheels of the carriage, and he liked it. In any case, he continued talking, saying that they should think about everything as they walked. There was a village nearby. Espen agreed with him. Our heroine, however, couldn't accept the fact that she'd returned 18 years into the past. Besides, How could she live as a child? The girl asked if Lepus could grant her a more mature body, to which he replied that he had no strength at all, so it was impossible. With a heavy sigh, our heroine set off on her journey as they had planned. But while passing through some aspen bushes, she heard a strange crying sound, so she decided to check who was making it. She soon came across a boy. To our heroine's surprise, she noticed a child in front of her, but she didn't understand what he was doing there so late. However, upon closer inspection, she finally admitted he was handsome. If you look closely, he's a real beauty. The only thing she didn't like was the color of his eyes, because they were exactly the same as the commander's. Somehow, she assumed that even as a child, Xenok wasn't such a timid crybaby as this guy. In her mind, Xenok was just as indifferent to everything as a child as he was as an adult. This guy was definitely not related to Xenok. One way or another, the girl decided to ask the boy why he was shaking so much. Confused, the boy asked the stranger if she was, by any chance, from the gang chasing him. Having received a surprised question about who they were talking about, the guy realized that she was definitely not one of those guys. Soon he began to cry even more. Espen, terrified, begged him to stop, knowing she had a weakness for baby crying. She started to squeeze Lepus, asking this half-bunny to do at least something. However, he settled even further on Espen's head and told her that he was invisible to children. Knowing he couldn't help, Espen asked the boy why he was wandering around in the middle of nowhere at such a time. A child. After all, the forest was a dangerous place. The boy looked at the girl in bewilderment and told her that she was also a child. Our heroine asked the boy not to be cheeky, to which he apologized, and soon said that there was a child in his gang called Pantheon, and they were bothering him. The guy said that this Pantheon is good with a sword, and he is also their teacher's favorite student, so he is valued. One way or another, the whole company mocks him, and after all the mockery, they leave him in the forest. Espen assumed he was training with him. The guy said yes, but he wouldn't be of any help, since he couldn't even handle a sword. Our heroine examined his wounds and rumpled clothes, surmising that those same guys had beaten him. The boy sobbed and said that was indeed the case. Espen immediately remembered something similar happening in the knightly order. There were freaks there who chose only objectively weak knights as opponents. Of course, they didn't get off easy, because our heroine couldn't allow such freaks to feel at ease. However, the fact that she sided with the weak was also the reason why many people hated her. Be that as it may, our heroine decided to support the boy and tell him he wasn't to blame. Those guys were clearly having problems with something. The boy then asked what he should do, to which our heroine smiled sweetly and told him that he should fight back. The guy looked away in bewilderment and said it was simply impossible. Regardless, he was grateful for the advice. Espen told him that everything was fine, and then decided to ask the boy what his name was. As soon as the boy started saying his name, he heard the shouts of the guys calling him Snot and looking for him, asking where he was. Lepus immediately twitched his ear, telling our heroine that a fight was most likely brewing. Espen told him not to talk nonsense. She didn't understand how she could fight with such a worthless body. Also, her legs had been shaking recently and she almost fell. Lepus explained to her that this was all because she wasn't yet accustomed to this body. The girl didn't understand what he meant. Just at that moment, that same gang of guys arrived, happy to have finally found this weakling. Pantheon laughed, saying that he thought he had escaped, but since he was here, they would give him special treatment. Looking at the boy, he also said that their teacher had given them consent to this treatment. Our heroine was outraged by this abomination. Reaching for a branch, she assumed they were novice knights, but said that 3 of them attacking one was too low. The guy, of course, turned his gaze from his target to the girl and, perplexed, asked her who she was. Espen told the boy that if he wanted to fight, he should do it one-on-one. She knew they dreamed of becoming knights, but beating up a weak boy with 3 of them? Of course, their actions can only be called violence, and they must be held accountable for violence. Soon she smiled sweetly, telling them that they were just a bunch of idiots who wouldn't be able to defeat the enemy if they fought alone. Pantheon was incredibly angry that some pathetic girl dared to scold him. Of course, without further ado, he made a dash and headed towards Espen, after which he swung his sword. Our heroine dodged without much difficulty and asked in surprise who taught the child such bad words. Shortly after Pantheon's attack, our heroine decided it was her turn to attack, so she waved her wand. A moment later, she hit the ground with it, and there was a rather large explosion that threw the boys some distance away. After this attack, our heroine raised her head, and looking at her opponent, she told him that he was a pathetic boor. Pantheon was depressed and shocked that the little girl attacked him, but he still instantly jumped up and told his assistants not to stand still and go on the attack. One of the guys ran up to the girl and swung his blade, but Espen dodged and immediately after defending went on the attack, hitting the guy in the face. Immediately after she dealt with one, she headed towards the remaining rude guy. In just a moment, all the bad boys were defeated, and Pantheon, in horror, told the girl that this was vile. Our heroine, meanwhile, appeared before this guy as a real nightmare. Soon she threw away her wand and, smiling sweetly, asked what he was even talking about. However, with tears in his eyes, the guy began to shout and tell her that she would get what she deserved. Immediately after these words, they began to run away. Our heroine sighed heavily, thinking that such children always have the same fate. Then she glanced at her hands. She didn't understand what was wrong with this body. While she was in it, she hadn't learned swordsmanship, yet it moved so naturally. Lepus smiled and asked if she'd recently asked him for something else. She should know he'd given her the best body. In any case, our heroine decided to put aside unnecessary conversation and, turning to the boy, asked if she was okay. He wasn't hurt, was he? The guy smiled and thanked her for saving him. She's so cool! Espen looked at him silently, while Lepus was very happy and danced on the girl's head. At that moment, the guy said that it was the first time he'd seen Pantheon run away from someone in fear, and yet none of the boys had ever managed to beat him. She's really cool, in his opinion. The guy continued talking for a while about how cool she was, but our heroine decided to interrupt him. Smiling, the girl said that she was grateful to him for the kind words, but she was still hungry. In that case, the guy said he'd feed her. Espen was just thinking about what the half-rabbit had told her about a village nearby. Our heroine asked the boy if he lived in the nearest village. He said that was the case for now, but his house was elsewhere. Espen didn't understand, of course, what it was, but she told him that, although it might sound strange, she had nowhere to spend the night that night. The guy assumed she'd been kicked out too, or, more accurately, had run away. In any case, he offered her his hand and said she could spend the night at their place. After a while, the action moves indoors. The maid, upon seeing her master, bowed to him and greeted him. Our heroine looked around and decided that the boy's expensive clothes did not at all match such a small house, and, moreover, it was strange that the servants called him master. Looking at him, she was confused. This was definitely a strange child. It felt like he was being bullied because of his status. Sometime later, Espen sat at the table, getting ready to eat. The food was truly extraordinary. Of course, it certainly couldn't compare to what was served in the dining hall of the knightly order. At that moment, the boy turned to her again and thanked the girl for helping him today. Our heroine said everything was fine, but perhaps she shouldn't have interfered. It's hard to calm these guys down all at once. Who knows? Maybe after today, they will start to bully him even more. However, clasping his hands, he said that it did not matter, because until now, there had been no one who would stand up for him, and she was the first. Our heroine was eating, but still looked at the servant in surprise and asked if she really wasn't doing this. The boy said that no one could support him when it came to learning to wield a sword, and his father simply kicked him out. The boy's expression immediately changed, because, apparently, this was not the most pleasant topic of conversation. One way or another, our heroine dared to suggest there was a reason for all this. One way or another, the girl decided to ask his name again. Knock. Having heard the words poorly, our heroine asked to repeat it again because she had not heard. The boy smiled at her and said his name was Zenok. Zenok Black Knight. Our heroine didn't even understand what she heard at first, so she continued eating. Although the name was still familiar. Finally realizing the information that had just reached her, Espen jumped up in confusion and asked again. Our heroine asked him several times, asking if his name was really Zenok Black Knight. The boy looked at her in surprise, but still said it was true. The girl then asked if he had any brothers or sisters. Zenok replied that he only had a sister. Looking at this small and harmless guy, our heroine could not understand how he could be that very commander-in-chief. Could it be that the legendary man whom everyone envied was like this in childhood. Our heroine immediately began to recall what he'd said about his teacher. Apparently, he was currently learning swordsmanship while living in this estate. The guy said that everything was correct, but unfortunately, nothing worked for him because he was afraid of the sword. Our heroine was in incredible shock, and upon hearing these words, she couldn't even put words together. As a result, the dinner ended with Espen trying to believe that it was indeed that same Zenok sitting in front of her. One way or another, after some time she was sitting in the room that was allocated to her. The girl still couldn't believe that she had returned to the past and even to a different body. Looking out the window, she had only one question. How was she going to get back? Her head was a complete mess. Remembering her past, she was undoubtedly no less interested in the question of whether she would be able to return to her body. Our heroine suddenly became thoughtful. If she had gone back 18 years, that meant the real her must be out there somewhere. However, all her thoughts were interrupted by Lepus, who told her that it was not worth it. Our heroine looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Lepus yawned and said that she shouldn't think about what she was thinking about. He assumed that she was already thinking about finding her true self and changing her past. Noticing how she was clutching the blanket, he realized that he was right in his assumption, but he hastened to upset her by telling her that this should not be done. Unfortunately, she was forbidden to meet her real body because they share the same soul. Our heroine asked the spirit what would happen to her if they met, to which Lepus told her that she would simply disappear. However, the rabbit did not want her to be sad, so he began to stroke her and say that if she helped find all the deities, he would fulfill any of her wishes. With hope in her voice, the girl asked if she could really wish for anything. Lepus confidently told her that he would grant her any wish. In that case, she hugged him and held him close. She had to do everything she could. Now she was in a different time, and no one was pointing fingers at her anymore. There are also no people here who hated her in the past, which means that she is free now. Our heroine suddenly began to think that if she could become an even more significant person. Espen then decided that this would be the case. But first, she should still fulfill Lepus's request and find all the divine beings. At that moment, the girl turned to Lepus again and asked him if she could ask him a question that had recently been troubling her. Who are divine beings? Lepus was very happy that she finally became interested in who they were, which once again proves that she is special. Our heroine said she simply experienced death and rebirth, so she's slowly coming to her senses. Besides, she hadn't planned on meeting Zenok. One way or another, at that moment, the rabbit told the girl that divine beings are animals that possess incredible power. With their power, it is possible to control a small village, an entire country, or even a dimension. Particularly dangerous creatures reside in a separate dimension, and it is he who guards them. Our heroine surmised that these creatures are gods. Lepus laughed and said that, in general, they could consider that. Their power was limited in this dimension, and they couldn't use it in large quantities. That's why he needs human help and needs to catch all the escaped animals before they cause any harm. Espen, hearing this story, merely nodded her head. She suddenly started cuddling the rabbit and reminded him that he told her that she shouldn't date her real self. Our heroine was wondering what would happen if she met someone she knew in that life. Lepus told her everything was fine and also reminded her that she looked completely different now. Our heroine said she understood. Soon she fell asleep, and the action takes us to the next morning, when our heroes were standing on the street. While eating an apple, our heroine turned to Zenok, asking if there really was some kind of training center for knights here. The guy was a little embarrassed, but still told his guest that she thought correctly. Well, the estate where Zenok lives belongs to Countess Aset, Duke Black Knight's fiancée. However, it turned out that Zenok's father was weak-willed. It was only for these two reasons that the boy was sent to this estate, temporarily abandoned. Our heroine was very interested in how the commander-in-chief was able to retain the title of Duke in such a situation. Moreover, Zenok's personality was too different from what she remembered. The guy suddenly asked Espen if she wanted to take a tour of the training center. Our heroine agreed. After all, if she had to catch divine animals, it certainly wouldn't hurt to take a look around. At that moment, they started walking, but to Espen's surprise, she noticed too many stares directed at them. Looking at the way the boy was bullied yesterday, she dared to assume that he was being bullied, and that he was hated just as much as she was. Thinking back to Espen's past, where she felt all those looks and ridicule, it was all too familiar to her. At that moment, our heroine turned around and noticed familiar guys in front of her. As a result, these little hooligans immediately turned around and started running away. Espen knew Zenok was probably scared to come here alone, so she hugged him and told him she was there. Soon, at our heroine's request, they went to a quieter place to talk. Suddenly, the two of them began talking. Zenok apologized and asked Espen to tell his story first, but the girl insisted that Zenok finish his. Eventually, Espen finally started talking. She sheepishly asked the boy if she could stay with him for a while. There simply wasn't anywhere to stay in this village. One way or another, our heroine could not believe that, of all people, she had stumbled upon the commander-in-chief. At that moment, the guy even flinched from the harshness of the question, but told her that she could stay with him as long as she wanted. Our heroine was grateful to him for this. It was still a good thing he didn't ask where she came from or who she was. Espen suddenly smiled and introduced herself by name. After all, she had to introduce herself. Then our heroine said what she thought about those hooligans. If Zenok is left alone, he will most likely be bullied again. Most likely, these guys will take revenge on him for the fact that she beat them. So since he allowed her to live with him, she will help him. The guy asked again in bewilderment, to which our heroine smiled and said that he could ask for anything. And again, for some unknown reason, tears welled up in Zenok's eyes. Our heroine, seeing them, naturally screamed in bewilderment and asked why he was crying. The guy sighed heavily and lowered his gaze, and soon said that no one had ever helped him. And Espen immediately remembered the words of the people from the knightly order. Our commander is great, but he's too cold. Sometimes they felt like he wasn't interested in anything at all, and so on. Despite all this, she also remembered her times when she was practicing at the training camp. Literally every time, Commander-in-Chief Zenok would pass by and praise Espen for what she was doing so well. The commander also said that if she needed help, she could contact him. Even though hatred for the commander was growing within her at that moment, those words remained etched in his memory for a long time. Then the entire knightly order was her enemy, with the exception of one single friend. At that moment, our heroine stroked Zenok's head and asked him to stop crying. She instantly turned back, unsure if she had actually just patted the commander-in-chief on the head. And yet, the feeling was too confusing. Deciding to change the subject, Espen said that, judging by everything, this was the training center. And should she enroll there too? Zenok asked again in surprise, and our heroine nodded and said that she also wanted to study the art of swordsmanship. Zenok blushed deeply at that moment. In any case, our heroine understood that the closer she was to him, the easier it would be to protect him. She was very curious about Zenok's inability to wield a sword in his youth. It was very strange. The future commander-in-chief of a knightly order couldn't handle a sword. Of course, the first thing that came to Espen's mind was that someone or something had influenced this. Our heroine suddenly asked him if he was coming here against his will. The guy started shaking his head. The boy explained that the truth is that his father told him to go to this center, and that he was just staying here. Espen told him she understood, and soon asked if he wanted to go for a walk in the village. She still needed to collect those divine Pokemon. Zenok asked again, and our heroine told him they didn't have to hang around here. As long as he wasn't in the center, there shouldn't be any problems. And once again, our heroine felt painfully familiar feelings that followed her from the shadow of the past. In any case, she said that there are no people dear to him in this place, so he must meet a person who will love and appreciate him. Of course, the girl didn't really want to get closer to him, but despite the fact that he helped her, she wants to repay him. Recalling the image from the past, our heroine clutched her heart. Zenok, perplexed, asked what had happened, to which the girl replied that everything was fine. Just as they were about to get up from the bench, Lepus jumped up in bewilderment and began calling out to the man. The rabbit screamed in terror without stopping and said that they had an emergency. Our heroine, perplexed, asked him what had happened, to which Lepus replied that he had sensed something. The girl asked if he was really talking about. Lepus interrupted her and said it was all true. He had sensed a divine being. Soon, he began jumping in one direction, saying they should follow it. Of course, our heroine immediately turned to Zenok, pointing in one direction and asking what was in that direction. The boy said in surprise that there was a village in that direction, which meant that the first animal was in the village. The girl immediately stood up, saying that she was heading there. Would he go with her? Zenok lowered his head and told our heroine that he had to meet with the teacher today. Espen assumed he wanted her to go to training with him. However, The boy said the teacher doesn't meet with strangers. He's very famous, and people even come from far and wide to see him. However, he said that he would ask the teacher if he could stay away from the center for a while. Soon, the guy looked up and told our heroine that he would like to be next to her. Our heroine was undoubtedly very surprised by these words, so she hesitated a little. Meanwhile, the guy looked at her with puppy eyes and asked if it was really impossible. Espen was shocked by this manipulation and wondered if this was really her future commander. However, at this moment the guy again shed tears, saying that he should not have said this, so he asks for forgiveness. With every word Enoch spoke, our heroine grew more and more shocked, and all the information was overwhelming. He suddenly asked if he was burdening her. Espen asked him not to talk nonsense and, patting his head, said he was fine. Without even noticing, she patted his head again. In any case, the girl said that she was just thinking about other things, so he shouldn't pay attention to it. Anyway, the girl headed towards the village, saying that she would take a walk and that they would see each other at dinner. Zenok said goodbye to our heroine. Meanwhile, Pantheon and his gang, hiding in the bushes, finally waited for that perfect moment. The action then takes us back to a time when Espen finally arrived in the village. The girl asked where they were going. After thinking for a moment, he turned around and pointed in one direction, saying that they should go there. However, the strange thing was that there was nothing there. Our heroine was completely confused, as she had no information about these creatures. She wondered if there was another way to find them, or if she should just explain it in a way she could understand. Lepus sighed heavily and said that where a divine being appears, the manifestation of his power is felt. The rabbit said that people call such phenomena miracles. Our heroine was very surprised. Just shortly after Lepus's words, a snowflake landed on our heroine's hand. The girl immediately assumed that this was that very divine power. But why was it so strange? Meanwhile, a villager announced in a tired voice that it had started snowing again. He didn't seem at all surprised. Our heroine decided to approach him, so turning to him, she asked in surprise if snow was really a common occurrence here. The man smiled and suggested that the girl wasn't from around here. Espen smiled and said that she was. A villager said that this phenomenon was surprising, but that it had been happening frequently in the village lately. Literally out of the blue, it starts snowing in the middle of the day, but no one knows why. Even the capital's magicians came here to see it, but they didn't notice anything strange. He admitted that it was unusual, but still, the snow did not pose any danger, so they, the villagers, simply enjoyed this phenomenon. At that moment, the man offered our heroine something interesting to try. He offered her a taste of one of the snowflakes. Having decided to obey, our heroine ate the snowflake, but soon said that it was completely tasteless. The man said it was all true. Snow usually has no taste, but some say it's slightly sweet. This is the first snowfall of the year. One way or another, the villager said that this snow is not dangerous in any way, so there is nothing bad about it. At that moment, someone turned to Berea and called him to come over, to which the man said that he was already on his way. Next, Lepus approached our heroine and told her that it was undoubtedly Snowweaver. This is a divine being who creates snow. The snow itself changes depending on his mood. Since the Snowweaver was the first creature she'd encountered, it wouldn't be easy. Our heroine asked what made it special. Lepus explained that if Weaver was in a good mood, the snow would taste sweet, but when he was in a bad mood, it would taste salty. Weaver, by the way, dislikes Lepus, so catching him will be difficult. Nevertheless, our heroine told him everything would be fine since they had no choice. She had a rough idea of what the creature was, so they would try to catch it. She suddenly asked if there was anything Weaver and other creatures might dislike. Lepus suddenly said that there are divine animals that like human food, but he doesn't know what the Snowweaver likes. Anyway, at that moment, the rabbit started pointing towards the alley, saying that he felt his presence there. Our heroine glanced at the alley and closed her eyes. Lepus asked if she was scared, to which the girl replied that she didn't like the dark. Unfortunately, it reminded her of being a victim of a fire as a child. Either way, Espen had no choice but to head into the dark alley, so she started walking. At that moment, our heroine noticed two adults standing near the child. The boys turned to the little boy and said that they only needed money, so as soon as he gave it to them, they would not touch him. The boy, however, was not a weakling, so he immediately told his uncles that they would regret coming here. Soon, several bright flashes were heard from the alley, accompanied by screams. The boy stood over the defeated men and smiled sweetly at them. but still the men were not going to give up. He had barely gotten up from the ground when he immediately fell. Soon a girl approached and told him that during a fight he shouldn't forget to watch his step. She said this because the enemy could knock him down at any moment. The boy looked at the stranger in surprise and thanked her for her help. Espen decided to skip the greetings and asked who he was. The guy smiled at her and said that he was a magician and his name was Kade, and he was pleased to meet a stranger. Our heroine looked at him in surprise because she was certainly not prepared to meet a magician. That is, a person who controls magic. The heavenly knightly order she belonged to was a place for knights and mages. Among her many sword comrades, there was also one sorceress. With the exception of the mages who joined the heavenly knightly order, most of the wizards lived in the magic tower. One way or another, at this moment, for some unknown reason, Kade was very surprised. The guy, without thinking twice, went to his new acquaintance to talk to her. Coming closer, he asked the girl if she was okay, and he hoped that he had not injured her with the magical explosion. Espen told him that everything was fine. It was just that she was seeing a magician for the first time, so she was a little confused. The boy smiled at her and soon guessed she lived in this village. He wondered what her name was. The girl was silent for a moment and soon said her name was Espen. The boy smiled widely at her again and said that, as he had already told her earlier, his name was Kade. Our heroine looked at him in surprise, not understanding the strange feeling inside her. Why was his name so familiar? It felt like she'd heard of him somewhere before. One way or another, she suddenly decided to ask the boy if he was too young to be a magician. Ignoring the girl's question, Kade raised his wand and told Espen that she was too young to handle the branch so deftly. Our heroine smiled at him and said it was because she was a knight. She then suggested that Kade lived here too. The guy, however, said that this was not so, because he was simply following his teacher, a great magician. At that very moment, a bolt of lightning seemed to run through Espen's body. To her horror, our heroine discovered that she had actually remembered that name. Kade is the same great hermit mage who existed in her past. When she became vice commander, the emperor was struck down by an unknown disease. The only thing that could heal the ruler was the magic of the great wizard. Just at that moment, the great magician Kade appeared in the empire, healed the emperor, and immediately disappeared. Of course, His Highness ordered the knights to find the great magician, but he, in turn, seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Espen remembered how hard they had been searching for the mage, so she couldn't understand how it had slipped her mind. In any case, our heroine realized that this guy would become a great magician in the future. So, an awkward thought immediately popped into her head, that she should become friends with him. While Kade was busy getting rid of the trash, our heroine decided to ask him why they came to this village. The boy said they had come here because they had heard that some miraculous phenomenon was happening here. He and the teacher were collecting some special treasures. Our heroine asked in surprise if they were really looking for treasure, but then she was interested in what kind of treasure they were talking about. For example, Kade named a harp that creates waves, a stone that makes food very tasty when you put it in food, and a time turner. The guy said that this thing was very valuable for their search, because with its help they could travel to the future. Espen screamed in confusion in her head, and at that moment, Kade summed up again that they arrived here because it started snowing in this village. Just at that very moment, Lepus screamed at the top of his lungs and told our heroine that they had another emergency. At that moment, the snow weaver finally appeared, so our heroine jumped up and blocked Kade. Our heroine thought that something great and terrifying would stand before her, but a child? Lepus asked the girl not to be afraid, because he was exactly what they needed. Confused, Espen asked if this little one really was a divine being. Our heroine couldn't understand why Lepus looked like an animal, while Weaver looked like a human. It was as if they were different species. One way or another, Lepus didn't have time to say anything, because there was no time for talking, because Weaver started running away. Our heroine, of course, ran after her. But at that moment, Kade turned to the girl in bewilderment. Espen apologized guiltily and said she had to run. Finally, she asked how long he would remain in the village. Kade said he thought they'd be here for a while. Espen grabbed his hand and said they'd see each other again. She still really wanted to ask Kade about the treasure, but right now the most important thing was to catch the snow weaver. In turn, Kade thought in surprise, assuming that Espen knew that kid. In any case, he couldn't understand why the girl was running around with some strange animal on her head. Should he follow her? Meanwhile, our heroine finally stopped after a long run. Unfortunately, They missed him. Deciding to put the bad thoughts aside, she told herself that, in any case, Weaver was somewhere in the village, so she just needed to find and catch him. At this point, as was easy to guess, Weaver was hiding and watching his pursuer. There was fury in his eyes. Meanwhile, the action takes us to the training center, where, as always, Pantheon and his assistants were bullying Zenok. Looking at the guy, the hooligans asked him in surprise if he would at least try to take a sword and try to parry the blow. Pantheon soon said that he couldn't do that because that idiot wasn't around. So today, he was going to break his legs. Zenok was incredibly scared, and what he wanted most right now was to go home and not have to feel all of this. He wanted a different outcome for himself. He immediately recalled the past, where people looked at him and asked how such a thing could have happened. What was the point of possessing such powerful force? Yet these memories were like fuel for him, driving him to change. So at that very moment, the boy grabbed the sword. Pantheon laughed at him and asked what he was going to do with the sword now. Instantly, he brought the blade to Zenok's neck and told him to at least try to hit him. With great difficulty, Zenok was finally able to get back on his feet, even though they were weak. Pantheon and his gang, meanwhile, began to roar with laughter, insulting Zenok. Once again, the boy was returning to the past. Once again, the hooligans threw the boy onto his back and started kicking him, despite the fact that he was screaming. The action shifts to the boy's past, which was rather dark. In a room with several corpses, the boy was sitting on all fours, holding back his vomit. A certain man rubbed his hands in amazement, saying that Zenok was the only one who had managed to endure all of this. The Duke, however, looked at him with disdain, saying that this piece of weakling couldn't even pick up a sword. Once again, the action shifts to Pantheon and his friends, who have finally stopped because they got bored. In turn, Zenok lay on the ground, beaten, and in front of him he only saw a sword, which was like a ray of light for him. Despite everything, he began to reach for his sword with the last of his strength. Meanwhile, Pantheon and the others were chatting and laughing. Just at that very moment, the incredible happened, because Zenok jumped up from the ground, and with a dash, he cut a piece of Pantheon's clothing. But fortunately for them, they managed to dodge. The boy looked up in bewilderment and was horrified to discover Zenok's terrifying gaze. Pantheon didn't understand what had happened, because this idiot couldn't even pick up a sword. The guy immediately fell to his knees, thinking that at this rate, he could be killed. He soon came to his senses and was horrified to discover that everything was fine, and Zenok was still lying on the ground. A shudder ran through Pantheon. Apparently, he'd only imagined it. In any case, he ordered his assistants to finish off this freak. The action once again takes us to our heroine, who was exploring the village and trying to find Weaver. She asked Lepus if he knew where Weaver was. The rabbit reminded Espen again that the Snow Weaver didn't like him, which is why he was hiding. Our heroine put her hands on her hips in surprise and said that she wondered why Weaver didn't like him. Lepus immediately remembered the past, in which they had fought with him too often, even saying that they hated each other. In any case, he decided not to show it, so he just said in surprise that he himself didn't know. Our heroine began to squeeze him once again, asking if he really didn't care at all about these divine animals. Having received no sensible answer, the girl said that they had realized that one of the creatures was in the village, which meant all that was left was to catch it, and now it was time to return. The girl also then looked at her only weapon, which was a branch. She understood that this branch would definitely not suit her anymore, so she needed a real weapon. It would be great to have the sword she had in the past, but with this body, it's unlikely that anything will work. And again, she sighed heavily, but reminded herself that it was time for her to return home. After some time, she finally came to the training center, but she was shocked almost immediately. Of course, she was shocked to see Zenok lying on the ground once again, unable to even move. Our heroine ran up to him and began trying to bring him to his senses to find out what had happened. Turning around, she noticed 3 little freaks who, upon noticing Espen, immediately began to run away. Espen started to get furious, so she almost ran after them. But at that moment, a trembling hand grabbed her. Zenok looked at her with tears in his eyes and said how he wanted to become stronger. Our heroine, looking at this desire, only bit her lip hard. The commander will become the most powerful knight. Zenok will be considered the greatest man in history. He will become his enemy's worst nightmare. But where did this talent come from? Our heroine understood that it couldn't simply disappear. Looking at the broken Zenok, The girl understood that his skills were hidden somewhere within this body. But should she help him? Approaching Xenoc a little closer, our heroine asked a logical question. Why does he want to get stronger? Our heroine, of course, assumed that he wanted to beat up those hooligans and thus take revenge. Looking at Xenoc, he only nodded his head guiltily and continued wiping away his tears. Espin nevertheless asked him to stop crying because she would help him. Yet our heroine understood that he would become strong even if she did not intervene. She will simply think that this boy and the commander she knows are different people. Besides, she certainly had nothing in common with the commander-in-chief, so she decided to help. Meanwhile, the action shifts to the adult Xenoc. The boy slammed the table and ordered him to find Lady Espin and bring her here. He ordered all the knights to search, simply because he did not give her permission. The guy also added that Lady Espin has no place to go, so they have to find her. And once again, the action takes us to Espin. Our heroine turned to Xenoc and told him she would help him, as he had done the same for her. She had no food, no home, but he took her in, so she will help him become stronger, which means from tomorrow he doesn't have to go to the training center. Our heroine explained these words by saying that from that moment on, he would be studying with her. She promised to help him, but he'd have to look for something with her. Anyway, she suggested they continue the conversation over dinner. A short time later, they were sitting at the table. Xenoc was looking forward to dinner, and our heroine suddenly announced that she was looking for a child. The guy certainly didn't expect to hear this, so he asked again. Our heroine immediately caught herself thinking about how cute he was, but she immediately dismissed those thoughts, because this boy sitting in front of her is the commander-in-chief. With a heavy sigh, she finally came to her senses. Soon she smiled sweetly and told him he had heard correctly. She was looking for the child. Espin began to describe him, saying that the child had white curly hair, was wearing shorts, and had small horns on his head. Xenoc, hearing the words about horns, was undoubtedly very surprised. In any case, Espin decided the boy would understand everything when he saw it. Meanwhile, Xenoc was intently drawing something. Espin had no idea what he was doing, until he suddenly announced that everything was ready. He immediately handed his drawing to Espin, asking if the child looked like him. Our heroine took the drawing in her hands and was very touched by how funny and cute this drawing was at the same time. Espin, however, immediately said that she thought Xenoc shouldn't be drawn anymore. After a pause, the guy even seemed upset. However, our heroine immediately continued to say that he should stop drawing simply because he would become the best knight in the empire. Our heroine then decided to ask him why he was living in this small house all alone. Why not move to the property his father left him? The guy looked away and said that it was too cold and unbearably gloomy in that place. Our heroine told him he could tell her anything he wanted, without even a hint of embarrassment. She'd soon disappear from his life anyway. The guy raised his gaze and became a little sad, but soon lowered it again and sighed heavily. Xenoc began to cry, saying that he had been bullied in the same way in this estate. Every time he thought about how long he would have to live being so weak, he always felt like he would grow up worthless and become a useless person no one needed. Our heroine immediately assumed that Xenoc wanted revenge, not only on those idiots. She understood that if she helped him now, he would not feel true gratitude towards her. But this little boy sheltered her and fed her, and she might pay for it. This man will become a brilliant commander, even if he looks like this now. Espin decided not to talk about such sad things, so she suggested they eat and have some fun. Xenoc looked at her in confusion and asked, "What about training?" Espin told him they didn't have to do it. The guy started to say something in surprise, but our heroine interrupted him, saying that he wouldn't become strong in just one day. That's why the same applies to rest. Nothing will change if he takes even a day off. The action, meanwhile, takes us to a dark alley, where Snowweaver was very angry. He began to replay in his mind the moment he saw Lepus sitting on a man's head. The guy simply didn't understand why he was with that person at that time. What was the reason? One way or another, he decided he wouldn't let it go that easily. The action takes us back to our heroine, who at that moment was just waking up early in the morning. Before she could even fully wake up, the girl heard a loud crack, so she turned around at the loud sounds. Stepping out into the corridor, our heroine noticed a maid lying on the ground, looking guiltily at Espin. Without even saying a word, she raised her hand and pointed towards the window. Of course, our heroine didn't wait for any answers, so she headed to the window to take a look at everything for herself. To her horror, the girl discovered that the entire village had been covered in snow overnight. Our heroine soon went outside, but she couldn't understand what was happening. It was all real snow. The villagers were perplexed and asked what was happening. The man said he couldn't believe it himself. Anyway, he said the Lord was already on edge. The mages would be arriving soon, so we had to wait. While our heroine was looking at the fallen snow in surprise, Lepus approached her and said that this was all the work of the snow weaver. He decided to remind that the divine animal that creates snow can change this same snow depending on its mood. Our heroine understood that if Weaver was in a good mood, the snow would taste sweet, and if she was in a bad mood, it would taste salty. The girl decided to try the snowflakes, but she immediately blushed. Her tongue felt like it was completely burned. It was incredibly spicy and bitter at the same time, and there was a sour aftertaste. Lepus jumped on Espen, assuming she was a bit spicy. Weaver isn't one to get angry often, but a sour taste meant he was very sad. Our heroine was surprised by what she heard. Why was Weaver sad? It was odd, because Weaver was very capricious. Right now, he was probably throwing dirt at Lepus, but why was he doing that? Espen couldn't figure out the reasons for his actions. In any case, the girl decided that it was time to act, so she turned to Xenok and told him that it was time to move out. Just at that moment, the girl started running and telling Xenok that there was a lot here, so he had to be careful. At that very moment, she slipped. Luckily for Espen, the guy managed to react in time, so he grabbed her hand and began to stare into her eyes. Our heroine admitted that he was quite strong, but at that moment, Xenok's face changed. The guy, perplexed, put Espen on her feet and soon ran away from her for some distance. Espen, however, even despite the guy's embarrassment, was surprised that Xenok managed to pick her up as if nothing had happened. This is the only reason our heroine assumed that Xenok had good physical skills from birth. That's why the conclusion was that he only had problems with swordsmanship. Our heroine began to look around anyway and noticed that most of the residents were depressed. One of the farmers spoke in horror about the end of the current harvest. Looking at an apple covered in ice, he asked how people would eat it. Only then did our heroine realize how much harm the snow weaver had caused to those around her. This snow is very dangerous for the village. Still, the girl couldn't believe that a divine animal was capable of such a thing. In any case, something had to be done. The girl immediately turned to Lepus and asked him if he could make himself visible to other people. Lepus snorted, saying he could do it since nothing was impossible for him. But why bother? Espen asked him to show himself to Xenok. Still, she was confused by the fact that she seemed to be talking to herself. And what's more, she was going to take Xenok with her. Lepus, perplexed, said he didn't want to, but our heroine immediately began to squeeze him, asking if he really didn't want to, or couldn't. Still, with great difficulty, he resigned himself. At that very moment, the divine being used manifestation magic and revealed itself to Xenok. As soon as Lepus appeared, the boy looked at it in bewilderment and asked what it was. He immediately came closer to touch this thing, when suddenly, Lepus bit his finger. Espen reminded him that she needed to find someone, a child, and this child was precisely what he needed. She introduced him as Lepus and asked him not to be afraid, as he was harmless. At that moment, the divine animal looked at Xenok and told him that he was obsessed with many things. The boy looked at the rabbit in confusion and asked what he was talking about, to which Lepus told him that he didn't seem to know anything, but that was even better. Our heroine told him that he would now be accompanying them, so she would tell him everything as it was. Lepus is a divine creature, just like the boy they were looking for. Sometime later, our heroine finally finished her story. Fortunately, Xenok understood everything and believed Espen's words. Espen was glad that he didn't have any doubts, even though it all sounded crazy. The image of Xenok looking into Espen's eyes was slightly different in her eyes. She hoped he would be okay. And again, our heroine began to think that the commander-in-chief was standing in front of her, so she began to ask herself to forget about it. And yet, she still couldn't believe that these two seemingly different people were actually the same person. At this time, Xenok was closely watched by Lepus, who confirmed that the guy really did have a lot of things that he was obsessed with. Also looking at our heroine, he understood that she still did not know about his character, but still he would prefer not to interfere. They seemed quite sweet and happy now, but still, ignorance can sometimes be beneficial. After some time, they began asking the villagers about the boy with white hair. One of the men said he had never seen anyone like him. They told each other that the boy had long ears. The man even said he didn't believe such people existed. Our heroine, in this case, understood that their investigation would not lead very far because everything seemed problematic. Just at that very moment, a loud scream was heard behind them, to which the boys, of course, turned around. The man screamed in horror and said that he fell because of some boy who had snow-white hair and some strange ears. Espen and Zenok immediately exchanged glances. There was no doubt about it. It was definitely a snow weaver. The man kept saying that the guy was wearing shorts, which was strange in that kind of weather. In any case, he was interrupted by our heroine, who looked at him in bewilderment and asked where he had seen this boy. Meanwhile, the action takes us to Weaver, who was standing on the roof and watching his creation. Meanwhile, the happy girl and her mother were making a snowman out of the snow, of which there was already a lot. The girl told her mother that their snowman was as big as her father's. Her mother suggested she make another one, to which she agreed. Weaver looked at them and wondered, parents? He didn't have any, so he asked them not to misunderstand him. At that very moment, out of some unknown hatred, he sent several ice spears towards the mother and child. Soon the ice spears touched the ground, and as a result, a broken snowman now lay on the ground. Luckily, at that moment our heroine came to the aid of the mother and her daughter and managed to save them. Our heroine laid them on the ground and, having calmed the girl and her mother, sent them away from here. However, at this point, the snow weaver did spot Lepus, so it was time to act. Once again, he began throwing a whole bunch of ice spears towards our heroine, who fought off the shards with only a stick. Regardless of the weapon, our heroine wondered, would she be able to use her sword skills? Meanwhile, a whole bunch of ice shards flew towards Zenok, who literally froze in bewilderment in the face of danger. Luckily, Espen came to his aid, waving her stick and deflecting all the shards. The block came out very well, but unfortunately for our heroine's wand, it was the last straw, because the wand broke into 2 pieces. Our heroine immediately wondered what to do, when suddenly at that moment Zenok shouted and pointed to the blacksmith's table, on which there were various weapons. Noticing a good sword, our heroine immediately made a dash to take it, but at that very moment, Weaver began attacking again behind her. However, she easily reflected all of this, and Lepus happily began to talk about how, as expected, he made the right decision in choosing this person. Both Snowweaver and Zenok were confused by the girl's skills, so they didn't understand who she was and why she was so strong. In any case, the divine being was about to attack our heroine once again, but at that moment, Zenok blocked her. At that very moment, our heroine screamed and asked Zenok to grab the barrel and throw it. The guy, without really thinking about it, grabbed the barrel and threw it straight at Weaver. As a result, he received a pretty good blow to the head, which even left him in a stupor. However, following Zenok's attack, our heroine also went on the attack, intending to deliver a crushing blow in a jump. As soon as she hit Weaver with all her might, she landed on the ground and wondered only one thing. Did it work? Soon, the dust from the impact cleared, and our heroine noticed a strange creature on the ground. What was it? Where had the boy gone? Our heroine approached him in bewilderment and, grabbing him by the tail, began to tug at it to see if he was alive. After some time, realizing that there were no signs that he would come to his senses anytime soon, the guys decided to knit a snow weaver. Soon the eyes of the divine creature began to open little by little, and the first thing he noticed was the puzzled look of the 2 children. He immediately began to twitch and scream in bewilderment, asking who they even were. Once again, our heroine asked why Weaver was in such a guise, since he had just been a human. Lepus explained that when divine beings experience shock, they revert to their true forms. Our heroine asked why Lepus was in the form of a bun. The animal screamed in confusion and said that this body was definitely not a bun. However, all this time they were being watched by Weaver, who was too angry. Suddenly, our heroine raised her head and, to her surprise, noticed snow. Moreover, there was too much of it. Lepus turned to Weaver and asked him not to waste his power, lest he disappear. The animal, perplexed, began to laugh and ask whether he would disappear or not. What difference did it make to them? Once again, he turned into his human form and looked with anger in his eyes at the people around him And not only, at that very moment he looked intently at our heroine and, using unknown magic, he scratched her cheek. Right after our heroine, he was about to take on Zenok, so he turned towards him. To his horror, he discovered that this boy was far from what he pretended to be. Weaver was both surprised and frightened by this. Either way, he jumped up and ran toward Espen, pushing her to the ground. So after he knocked the girl to the ground, he just walked forward. Our heroine, who was lying on the ground, and Zenok, who was trying to grab her, fell after her, asked the guy if he was okay. At that moment, the guy hung right over her and looked into her eyes in bewilderment. The guy immediately turned incredibly red, because he definitely didn't want to attack Espen like that. Our heroine, in turn, decided to change the topic of conversation, suggesting that this child had run away again. Zenok sighed and said that was true. Espen smiled and patted him on the head, thanking him for helping her and saying he was a great guy. Again, these words were incredibly important for Zenok, because he had never heard them before. In any case, it was impossible to lie on the ground for long. So, getting up from the ground, he offered his hand to Espen and raised her. While our heroine was talking to Lepus, Zenok came up to her and sat on her knee. The guy grabbed her by the dress and asked her if he was useless. Our heroine was at first very surprised by this question, but then she smiled, looking at him. The girl told him not to talk nonsense, because he tried very hard, and she was proud of him. The longer she looked at him, the more the image of the commander-in-chief faded from her memory. At that moment, Espen noticed Zenok was crying, so she asked him, confused, what was wrong? He told her he felt better. Looking at Zenok's sincere smile, our heroine decided that he really didn't seem as bad to her as he had in the past, because now he was her friend, whom she met here. Meanwhile, Lepus was watching the guys who were chatting so sweetly, sighing heavily, and saying again that this guy was obsessed, which meant she would regret it. In any case, at this rate, a week passed. The village was still covered in snow. The guys, seeing one of the houses, even suggested that it might collapse due to the amount of snow lying on it. The snow continued to fall, growing heavier each time. After the culprit fled, they never saw him again. Espen, of course, assumed that he was hiding somewhere, but it would be difficult to find him. Despite the climate change, local residents still managed to adapt, but this did not apply to everyone. Most of them panicked, asking when the mages would arrive. They hoped it would be real mages, not the ones from last time. They couldn't wait for this damn snow to stop. Espen generally understood why they were so upset. However, if the royal knights come to the village, then the situation will become much more serious. From her experience, she says that these people do not forgive those who harm people. Our heroine turned to Lepus, asking him if he really didn't know why the snow weaver was acting like this. The rabbit merely shook his head, indicating that he didn't know. Espen asked him to be serious, as this was important. However, he only landed on Espen's head and settled himself more comfortably on it. Our heroine couldn't understand. Was this dumpling with legs really going to behave like this until the very end? One way or another. At this point, Lepus said that divine animals have no concept of family. However, Weaver really wanted to be human so he could have a family. That is why he got himself a human form and moved to the village. Nevertheless, our heroine was still interested in why exactly Weaver hated Lepus. The divine being explained that he wanted and decided to take Weaver in and make her his ward. Lepus assumed that this was the parents' way of thinking. Espen, perplexed, yelled at him and said that it wasn't true. At that point, Lepus sighed and said that he, too, did not know what a parent was. Espen told him that she understood, but he still had to understand that when the royal knights arrived here, they would capture the snow weaver. After stroking Lepus, she told him that she did not know how divine animals could be accepted in this world. After all, the worst-case scenario is that Weaver could be experimented on or killed outright. Our heroine picked up Lepus and, looking at him, asked if he was okay. However, in response, she saw only the ever-smiling and sweet face of the animal. Espen sighed in disappointment, having absolutely no idea what he was thinking. In any case, she decided it was time to go. After some time, among the crowd of people, our heroine noticed Zenok, who was sitting on the fountain. Our heroine asked how long he'd been waiting for her, since she'd been gone for a while. The guy smiled and said everything was fine. They decided to split up and search for the divine animal to save time. Unfortunately, neither he nor Espen were able to find it. Zenok apologized to Espen in disappointment. Our heroine told him everything was fine, as she'd been looking for him for a whole week and hadn't found a trace of him. The girl continued to smile and look at him, saying that he had tried hard. Soon she turned her gaze to Xenoc's sword, which was usually holstered. He himself admitted to her that he had difficulty holding it. Nevertheless, our heroine turned to him and said that very soon he would be able to adapt to it. By the way, our heroine mentioned that it was high time to start her long-awaited workout. Xenoc was only too happy about that. Espin looked at him and thought how cute he was. And again she began to bring herself to her senses by reminding herself that this was the commander-in-chief. She should look at him differently. But still, this boy standing before her is simply Xenoc. Soon they decided to approach the woman and, to their luck, she said that she saw some child in one of the alleys. Without thinking twice, our heroes began to run with all their might towards the alleyway indicated by the woman. Literally, a moment later, they finally found this guy they had been looking for so long. Without thinking twice, our heroine made a dash and ran to suddenly attack Weaver. But unfortunately for Espin, he managed to react. Shortly after her attack, our heroine screamed in confusion as a surprised Katie stood right in front of her. However, our heroine noticed him too late, so the sword swing was inevitable. Now they would collide. Anyway, at that moment the guy waved his cane and apologized to Espin. A moment later, our heroine soared into the air, which she was certainly surprised by. Soon the guy smiled and looked at the girl and asked if he remembered correctly that her name was Espin. Our heroine, still in the same bewilderment, sank to the ground and, not understanding what was happening, nodded her head. Some time later, she came to her senses and asked for forgiveness in horror. She had confused him with someone else. Cabe laughed and said that everything was fine, so she didn't have to apologize so much. And yet, Espin continued to stand her ground and ask for forgiveness because she didn't think she would meet him. Cade suddenly decided to ask what exactly had happened. Why was she suddenly attacking people? Our heroine laughed and said that they were actually looking for someone. She explained that they were looking for a boy about his age, which is why she got them confused. Cade smiled and said that the alleys were dark, so it was entirely possible. After that, he finally decided to ask who it was standing next to her. Our heroine happily announced that it was her friend, and his name was Xenoc. He was helping her! Cade greeted Xenoc, who in turn stood behind Espin, surprised. The girl laughed and asked for his understanding. She explained that he was a bit shy. However, Cade saw something she didn't, so he was quite surprised by her words. Deciding not to attach any importance to it, he said that he did not know why they were looking for that man, but he still decided to offer them help. Espin decided that it would be good to get help from the great mage in the future, however. She suddenly simply thanked him for his offer to help. Unfortunately, she understood that he might have too many questions that she would not give him answers to. That's why she said that she didn't want to seem impudent, but she asked to keep everything a secret, and if it became difficult, then he might not help. The guy was, of course, surprised by this, but he still said he'd fulfill her request and be like a fish. He immediately felt like something interesting was happening. Espin sighed and asked if he had heard of divine animals. The boy said he knew they were beings from other dimensions. He'd heard from his teacher that the world was divided into different dimensions, and they were intricately intertwined. Also, sometimes creatures appear from intersections, and it also happens that people travel through time. Our heroine immediately decided that she couldn't let it show, so she said in bewilderment that she now understood what it was. Kate added that even many magicians don't know the concept of divine animals, so it's surprising that she knows something about them. Our heroine smiled and said that at that moment she was interrupted by a scream coming from the square. They turned around in bewilderment. Voices were shouting and saying they had found the suspect. Espin guessed that this was what they needed, so she suggested that the boys follow the screams. After a while, they approached the corner and began to peer around it. They immediately noticed some kind of commotion. Looking around, they noticed the knights. But where the hell were they even going? Espin thought. Could they have figured out that the snowfall was caused by a snow weaver? Apparently, because he attacked people, a report was filed, which means that trouble is coming. Our heroine turned to the boys and suggested they follow the knights. Perhaps what they were looking for would be there. At that moment, Xenoc, perplexed, told Espin that the knights had split up. What should they do? In that case, the girl said that they would most likely have to split up too. Cade said that in that case he would go alone. If the person they were looking for wasn't with him, he could rush to them immediately. He also said he'd cast a tracking spell on them, and if Weaver ended up in his possession, he'd send a signal. Incidentally, he decided to ask who they were looking for. Espen wasn't a talkative person, so she only said one sentence. "They're looking for a baby with horns." Cade said he understood. If he happened to have it, he would launch firecrackers into the sky using magic. The action takes us to the knights, who were baffled by the fact that they'd missed it. The second knight asked if they'd checked everything. At that moment, our heroine asked Seductive if he was okay. Confused, he replied that everything was fine, but the knights seemed to have lost the Snow Weaver. In that case, the guy still decided to ask in surprise what they should do now. Espen assumed that, apparently, the knights were indeed looking for the same thing they were looking for, which meant that the Snow Weaver was not far away. It would be nice if Lepus tried to sense Weaver's presence, but this little lamb avoids him. Suddenly, our heroine looked up and spotted Weaver. What a stroke of luck! Meanwhile, the guy peered around the corner, thinking about those pesky little people. He'd spent a lot of effort trying to get rid of his own traces. However, at that very moment, he heard a rustling sound behind him and immediately turned around in horror. Our heroine stood before him, grinning very hard as she looked at him. And now he was found. Of course, the first thing Weaver decided to do was try to escape, but Espen immediately told him that he would not leave so easily. The girl did a somersault, and in a moment she was in front of him. Our heroine smiled and, looking at Weaver, told him that, as she had said earlier, he could not hide from her. The guy understood that he should under no circumstances fall into the hands of this girl. In just a moment, it turned into a huge ice floe that hung in the air. Espen knew this was a real disaster, because if the ice floe fell, those people might notice. In that case, the knights would undoubtedly arrive. Eventually, these people captured the Snow Weaver. Meanwhile, the guy wasn't particularly positive, so he told our heroine that if she didn't leave, he'd kill her. Espen sighed heavily, realizing she had no choice. She couldn't make too much noise, so she'd have to eliminate him silently. However, she only has one chance. At that very moment, our heroine flew past the ice floe and made one precise swing of her sword. A moment later, she pulled him out, telling him that he had certainly been distracted in vain. After knocking him to the ground, she raised her blade and pointed it at him. However, Weaver had no intention of giving up. Our heroine, looking at him, didn't really understand what was happening to him because for some reason he started getting angry. Weaver suddenly said he would destroy her because he was tired of putting up with this. Espen asked him why he hated her so much. Weaver asked if she was asking because she honestly didn't know. However, at that moment, Seductive called out to Espen, saying that the knights were already on their way here. Our heroine understood that things were bad for them, and the situation was definitely getting out of control. At that very moment, Cade appeared above them, finally able to find them. The guy smiled and asked if they needed help. Our heroine screamed that they absolutely needed it. Meanwhile, the knights had just arrived at the scene of the incident they had been told about, but there was no one there. However, one of them said he definitely heard a noise coming from there. They must have imagined it, so they decided to check elsewhere. Cade smiled again and said everything was ready. She wanted them to remain undetected, he understood, right? Espen asked the mage if people outside the barrier wouldn't hear them. The man said yes. In that case, she took out her blade, because she could use her power to the fullest extent with peace of mind. Cade was immediately puzzled to realize that this was a swordmaster who possessed unusual strength for her age. Or perhaps she was some kind of genius? After some time, Weaver was once again captured and tied with a rope. Before the battle, Espen looked far more dejected than she did now. It had been so long since she had last stretched her body like this. In any case, she immediately approached Seductive and asked if he was injured. The guy said everything was fine. Cade considered this. Come to think of it, Espen had simply managed to capture this overly active divine beast. Some time ago, Seductive approached Cade, pointing to the canopy and asking if breaking the canopy would pacify the lamb. Cade suggested that this might work. In that case, the boy turned to the mage and asked for his help, since it seemed he was the only one who could get up there. After a moment, Seductive finally drew his sword and made a quick swing. At this rate, the lamb was finally caught, which made him incredibly angry. Only thanks to this, our heroine soon hung over him, smiling slyly and saying that it was all over. After some time, Seductive looked at his hands in bewilderment, realizing that he had managed to strike with the sword, even though its capabilities were hidden. Until now, it seemed to him that people who wielded a sword were cruel and callous. However, thanks to Espen, he realized that swordsmanship could be truly beautiful. Looking at her, he wanted to be like her. Our heroine approached him again, asking if he was okay. Was he in any pain? The guy turned around and, bewildered, started talking about how he'd only managed to strike with the sword thanks to her. He wasn't afraid at all. She's the best. Hearing these words, our heroine was perplexed, because on the one hand it was pleasant, but on the other, she went back in time again, remembering how the commander-in-chief told her that she was the best and that she could be proud of herself because she was his only deputy. Espen still couldn't understand why the memories she had forgotten kept popping up in her head again. At this point, Kate turned to the boys and suggested that they first leave before speaking. Yet he understood, as did everyone else, that this place would be filled with knights. The very next day, Weaver was still shouting, saying that he had nothing to talk about with people. The cute-looking lamb even started screaming and telling them all to die, so our heroine covered Xenoc's ears. After that, Espen asked the guy if he had everything ready. Xenoc looked at her and nodded. Soon he pulled out a large feather and, approaching Weaver, began to vigorously tickle it. The animal began to burst into laughter and tell the man to get lost. Our heroine, for her part, looked far too menacing. She told Xenoc to make sure Weaver wouldn't even think about escaping. After that, she wondered what she should do. She'd been asked to gather the divine animals, but not to hold some horned boy hostage. If this lamb escaped again, she would have more trouble, and Lepus still hadn't said what to do with it. The girl picked him up and said that she didn't think she would be able to catch Weaver if he escaped again, so he should do something about him. The situation is far more dangerous because the townspeople have asked the royal knights for help. She asked him if he wants to collect all the divine animals. Lepus nodded. Espen then asked him to promise to be honest with her and answer everything she asked. He wouldn't stalk her forever, would he? Lepus nodded again. Our heroine was very glad that he still understood her, so she hugged him. After a while, the girl approached the boisterous Weaver, who was muttering incessantly about something. Seeing Espen, the guy started screaming again and asking to finish him off. Otherwise, he would run away again. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he really didn't mind if they killed him. The boy asked again, perplexed. Espen told him that in that case, she'd ask Lepus if she could kill Weaver. Weaver narrowed his eyes, certain that Lepus would give the go-ahead. However, at that very moment, a puzzled Lepus appeared and said that he would not allow the Snow Weaver to be killed. Our heroine looked at Lepus in confusion and asked what would happen if Weaver escaped again. The divine beast said that in that case, he would have to be recaptured. Weaver couldn't believe his ears, so he asked, a little puzzled, if Lepus didn't hate him. Our heroine looked at him and asked if he really hated him. Lepus said that was nonsense and he never hated him. In that case, Espen suggested handing Weaver over to the royal knights. After all, if he ran away again, they might catch him and make a skewer out of him. Lepus, however, said that this would not work because Weaver must return home alive. Weaver didn't understand what was happening. He even had the feeling that Lepus was thinking about him. Our heroine approached the captive and said that although she had not known this pig rabbit for very long, but still, as she began to squeeze him, she said that she felt like he really cared about him. Soon after these words, for unknown reasons, Weaver turned into an animal and rushed into Espen's arms. Our heroine certainly didn't really understand what was happening, but she still hugged him back and asked him to stop crying. At that moment, Kate approached them, clapped them, and congratulated them on the truce. Once the problem was solved, the magician asked if he could ask this strange rabbit something. The action moves forward a week. From that point on, the snow has stopped, the weather has cleared, and everything is fine. And our heroine finally began training Xenoc in the art of swordsmanship. We're just now transported to one of the training sessions. Our heroine told Xenoc to hold out for another 10 minutes. Since the boy was afraid of swords, the training began with him simply getting used to the weapon. She suddenly wondered how he had managed to break the canopy a week ago. In any case, she put that thought aside for now. She turned to Xenoc and told him he could rest. Weaver, perplexed, turned to the human, namely Espen, and said she was a wonderful teacher. Incidentally, he'd been living with them since his capture. The maid's sister received the new tenant rather strangely. She was very happy that their master had acquired another friend. At that moment, Weaver mentioned that the boy was weak. The boy, perplexed, began to deny it, saying it was nonsense, because he wasn't weak. At this time, our heroine watched them, but nevertheless, her thoughts were still occupied with something else. Before this, Katie asked her if this rabbit really told her to catch the divine animal. He also suggested that this was why she was staying at Zenok's house. Our heroine said she simply had nowhere to sleep. Katie suddenly looked at her in surprise and asked if she'd mind coming to the dorm where he was staying. He could help her find other creatures if there were any nearby. He also said that his teacher would be able to help her from time to time. Espen understood that Cade's teacher was the one who would make the boy a great mage. Still, it was really not bad and looked like very good conditions, but at this point, Zenok intervened. The guy, perplexed, began to tell the girl to stay and live with him. He grabbed our heroine by the hand and asked if she could stay next to him. Espen blushed furiously at all this. The main thing was to control herself and remember that the commander-in-chief stood before her. The girl laughed anyway and told Katie that she wouldn't be able to move into the dorms. The magician then said they'd see each other next time. She herself understood that this was the right thing to do, because she had to teach Zenok in exchange for him allowing her to live with him. By the way, she suddenly wondered where the next divine animal was. Meanwhile, a certain creature standing in front of the gate began to smell the scent of Snowweaver coming from there. The next day, our heroine asked Kate in bewilderment if the magician would really arrive here. The guy said that the Lord himself personally sent the request, because it looks like due to the snow situation, he will come to the city to investigate. Our heroine was perplexed. She didn't know what to do or what to do now, because a mage from the Heavenly Knightly Order was about to arrive. Kate approached her and patted her on the shoulder, asking her not to worry so much. If he fails to find the divine lamb, the situation will soon calm down. At that moment, Weaver took out an ice cube, telling the man that if this magician even tried to offend her, he would immediately give him an ice cube. At that moment, the guy suddenly fell silent. Weaver suddenly said he wasn't entirely sure he'd succeed. Weavy, this is now a nickname for the Snowy Weaver, and they came up with it to call him more affectionately. As soon as the little one moved in with them, she asked him if he knew anything about other divine animals, but in response, he only shook his head. It turns out that he hadn't even seen other animals, but it would be good for her to know at least something. After thinking for a bit, the guy said that as soon as he woke up in this world, there were 3 of them. Our heroine asked him again in surprise, to which he said that he clearly remembered the green meadow on which they lay. One of them ran away, saying that he wanted to see lightning, but the second really wanted to find flowers. Weavy smiled and said that he was the only one who remained in the city, because he felt it. Our heroine immediately realized that the divine animals had scattered in all directions, meaning they needed to search outside the city. How difficult! The action shifts to the palace. The man asks in surprise if the Duke's son has returned yet. The butler said that a long time had passed since he was last seen here. He also added that the teacher who works with Zenok said that he had not seen the boy for a long time. Lord Esset was incredibly unhappy about this, so he said outright that it was very bad. Duke Black Knight's offspring is a foolish boy, and he was told to look after him. Moreover, the man even said that if he succeeded in making a warrior out of his son, he would generously reward him. Esset even hired a teacher who asked for a lot of money in order to teach Zenok. He immediately ordered the boy and the teacher to be called. The butler asked again in surprise. The man said that he had to take control of the situation, otherwise nothing would work. Meanwhile, Cade returned to his place, but Zenok began to diligently engage in training. The guy soon stood up and asked Espen in surprise who taught her the art of swordsmanship. Our heroine smiled and told him that she was born talented. The guy looked at her admiringly, saying it was cool. Espen calmed him down anyway and said it was just a joke. When she was little, she had a teacher who was a retired knight of the Heavenly Order. Still, if you think about it, he is still an active knight at the present time. She also said that, to be honest, she has improved her skills a lot. Where she was and studied, there was a man whom she considered a genius. She always tried hard to become better all the time, but that genius was too smart and capable and always stood in her way. If you think about it, despite everything, she really did respect him. Zenok, listening to her story, was very surprised. The boy did not take his eyes off Espen. Taking a step towards her, he asked the question that interested him most. Did she like him? Just thinking about the commander-in-chief, our heroine began to laugh and ask Zenok not to talk nonsense. Wiping away her tears, she said that she did not like that man at all. Moreover, she even told him that she hated him so much that Zenok couldn't even imagine. At that very moment, A memory popped into her head of Zenok asking her in the morning if she had slept well. Our heroine blushed like a tomato just remembering this, and she couldn't hide it. The guy looked at Espen in confusion and asked what was wrong. Our heroine, almost in tears, told him that everything was fine. Then she asked him to continue training and not be distracted by anything. But at that very moment, the boys heard a rustling sound behind them, which made them turn around. In front of them, they noticed the same young freaks who had bullied Zenok. Espen glared at them and asked if they were now going to follow the victim home. Instantly, she swung her sword and placed the blade right next to Pantheon's neck. One of the boys nevertheless asked her to calm down, because they came here to convey the teacher's message. Our heroine asked again, and Pantheon said she'd heard correctly. Looking at Zenok, the boy said the teacher was looking for him. Espen immediately remembered how the guy said that this man came from far away, and that he was also a famous knight. But still, she knew that Teacher Zenok was definitely not the type to talk. In any case, the situation looked too unusual, so it was necessary to think about what to do. Espen still put away her sword and asked how she could believe that they were telling the truth. After all, she decided to remind them that they were mocking Zenok. One of them started shouting and saying they weren't lying, but Pantheon immediately shut him up. At that moment, the boy said that although he was still studying, he considered himself a knight, and it was not in their nature to lie. He had orders to deliver a message. He also looked at Zenok and said that if he didn't show up, he would be in trouble, right? Our heroine still looked at them with a degree of skepticism because she didn't want to trust them. Anyway, Zenok petted her and told her not to worry. He'd be back soon. The boy also said that he would inform the teacher that he would no longer attend the center. Looking at the surprised Espen, he said that he wanted her to teach him. Soon, Zenok headed towards Pantheon, but our heroine still didn't understand what it was for a long time. One way or another, the guys left. Our heroine hoped that everything would be okay with him. Immediately, the expression on Zenok's face, which always made her feel sorry, popped into her head. So jumping up from the stump, the girl decided that she had to go after him. After some time, she was watching the training camp from the bushes. Espen wondered if she could slip inside, or if she could do it quietly. Lepus suddenly asked Espen if she wanted to conceal her presence. Confused, our heroine replied that she did. Lepus then said he would help her with that. Our heroine, however, did not understand what he was talking about, so she asked him, and Lepus replied that he could make her invisible. Espen, perplexed, asked why he was only talking about this now. Lepus admitted he was too lazy. Espen told him to stop talking and get to work. In just a moment, everything was ready. Espen watched the squad and assumed that following Zenok was a good idea. However, after examining the entire area, our heroine was horrified to discover that Zenok's teacher was standing right now and scolding his student. Our heroine, watching this nightmare, could only remember her past. Likewise, Espen noticed another man standing nearby. It seemed this was Lord Aset. Count Aset, although he was subordinate to Duke Black Knight, had absolutely no influence or power. At that moment, the teacher asked in surprise if Zenok was really planning to leave. He'd only said he was just taking a break. The teacher told him he couldn't hope to train on his own. The Count also told him that at this rate, he'd be beaten constantly. Now our heroine finally understood the whole problem. The commander-in-chief had been completely alone this whole time. Lepus decided to ask the girl what she ultimately decided to do. Does she need help? Espen said she couldn't just watch this happen, so she should go and get Zenok. Lepus asked how she would do that. Looking down, she said he was right, because in this body she couldn't do anything. She had no money, no status. Still, she thought about it. It would be enough for her to become an adult. Lepus asked if the problem was really all in the body. The divine animal said that if she really needed to become an adult, then he could fulfill her request. But for a while, Lepus said she could consider it a bonus for being able to catch the snow weaver. The teacher continued to scold Zenok. The boy, in turn, was wondering what he should do. What should he do? And would he be able to escape from here? Lord suddenly said he hoped Zenok understood him perfectly. Starting tomorrow, he was required to come to the center every day, and there were to be no further objections. However, at that moment our heroine came out, in an adult body, and said that if he had no objections, then she did. Zenok, of course, recognized Espen in the woman's face, but he didn't understand what this was all about. Lord Aset was no less surprised. so he looked at the girl and asked who she was. Our heroine told him that she was the young master's guardian. Espen immediately assumed that, judging by her manner of speech and appearance, she was clearly an aristocrat. Could it be that the Duke had sent her? It was also at this point that the girl said that she was Zenok's swordsmanship teacher. Espen smiled, looking into the Lord's eyes, and told him that she was still much better at teaching. The teacher, perplexed, shouted and asked how he could trust someone he'd never met. Espen said that if he didn't believe her, he could attack her. With incredible confidence in her eyes, our heroine told him that he could attack her to see the difference between them. The boy immediately noticed that she looked strong. He wouldn't be able to do anything to her, and in that case, the Count simply wouldn't pay him. Knowing there would be no confrontation, our heroine took Zenok and led her away. The boy, surprised, asked if it was Espen. The girl said she'd tell him everything later. Suddenly, the teacher turned to her and told her to wait. If she was truly teaching the young master, he must demonstrate the results of his training. The teacher pointed to Pantheon and said that if Zenok could defeat his student, he would accept defeat. Without a shred of doubt, our heroine said that she agreed, but they should know that they would not be able to go back on their words. The teacher then looked at the Count and asked his lordship if he agreed. Seeing Espen's sly smile, he said he was sealing this deal in the Lord's name. The loser would have to comply with the winner's terms. After a while, the boy sat there, both in tears and in panic. Lepus, perplexed, asked what had happened. Our heroine told him to leave him alone for now. He held up well, but fell apart as soon as they got home. Looking at him, she wondered if everything would be okay. She hoped so. Just then, Katie flew to Espen. The girl greeted him and asked if he could just fly there. The guy said there were no people around, so there was nothing to worry about. The boy then looked around in surprise and asked what had happened. Why was the atmosphere so gloomy here? Our heroine sighed heavily and said in response that there was a reason for this. Espen approached the guy shortly after and asked him if he really thought he couldn't handle it. Zenok turned around and asked her, what if he couldn't win? Would she really leave him? Our heroine sat down next to him and asked him why he thought that. Until he mastered the sword perfectly, she had no intention of parting with him. After all, he was her first student. In that case, Zenok said, hand on heart, that he wouldn't cry anymore. He really wanted to win. Although Espen supported him, she suddenly thought that Zenok still hadn't overcome his fear of the sword. At this time, Kade, who was still standing there, was watching them closely. The action shifts back some time. The boy, as he always did, stands on the roof, watching Espen. At that moment, she was little, and for some reason, she was watching someone from behind the bushes. Soon after, there was a small flash that caused the girl to instantly become an adult. Looking back, he knew for sure that it was the use of magic, but he didn't understand how she managed to do it, since she wasn't even a mage. He also had questions about this divine animal that was constantly nearby. Too many questions and no answers. Her main question was only who she really was. Should he tell his teacher? He immediately decided that this was a bad idea, because in this case there was a high probability that she would be captured and taken to the magic tower. At that moment, a question pulled him out of his thoughts. The guys were asking Katie what he thought. He asked if he remembered correctly that they said nothing would come of fear. Our heroine said that everything was correct. The guy immediately thought about this question. Thus, the action shifts to a month later, to the day of the duel. Pantheon has been training with his teacher all this time. The boy laughed, thinking that they thought this brat could reach his level in just a month. Impossible! Pantheon suddenly turned and asked the teacher if he was confident of his victory. The man nodded his head without hesitation. However, the teacher told him that he had to be extremely careful. After some time, they were standing in the ring, which meant that the duel was about to take place. Espen looked at Teacher Pantheon, telling him that they had been preparing seriously. One way or another, the Lord interrupted her and reminded her that, as promised, the loser would agree to any demands of the winner. At that very moment, as soon as the participants in the battle stood on either side, the referee waved his hand and announced the beginning of the battle. Zenok was focused on the battle and determined to win. He stood there, simultaneously recalling what Espen had told him. The girl, looking at the tired Zenok, said that he had enough skills. She also told him that he was good with a sword, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to destroy all the dummies they had. In any case, Espen herself understood that a month is not enough for a person to completely overcome their fear, but she had a plan. She'd simply change the environment, and Cade would help her with that. On the day of the duel, he had to make it so that Zenok would not see what was happening, but would mentally be in another place. It is in this other reality that Zenok will only be shown what he likes. Of course, the guy started thinking about flowers, fields, clear skies, and also the only thing that popped into his head was Espen. If he focuses on the things he likes, all his fears should evaporate. At this point, Pantheon screamed in bewilderment and asked his opponent why the hell he was smiling. The guy couldn't stand it, so at that very moment he lunged towards Zenok and attacked him, but their blades touched. Pantheon assumed the brat had been training, which surprised him greatly. But why was he so bold? At that moment, Zenok looked at his opponent and asked him in surprise if he had always been so weak. The unexpected question even caused Pantheon to stumble back and lose his balance, giving Zenok an opportunity to attack. Within a moment, Pantheon's sword flew into the air and soon landed, just like the sword's owner, who fell to the ground and looked at Zenok in bewilderment. The guy looked into his opponent's eyes and soon told him that he really couldn't show anything special. The boys started shouting and talking in confusion about Zenok's victory, while the Lord was perplexed. He smiled anyway and decided that he could now, with a clear conscience, inform the Duke that his son was making progress. While Lord Aset was looking at Zenok happily, a puzzled and now former teacher of Zenok approached him. The man raised his head and looked at him with a cold gaze and told him that he was fired. Immediately after the battle ended, Zenok was incredibly happy and excited, so he ran towards Espen. The action moves forward 18 years. The building of the Heavenly Knights. The knight sat down in a chair, saying that he could easily die like this, and all because of his worthless vice commander. Another guy agreed with him. They all wondered when the commander-in-chief would stop doing who knows what. Of all of them, only the sorceress remained silent, silently listening to their nonsense. The knight suddenly asked if they'd heard that the commander-in-chief had managed to capture a first-degree criminal. Since when had the commander mastered swordsmanship so flawlessly? The guys assumed that he had been good with a sword since childhood, if not since birth. The guy was perplexed that no one knew the answer to this question. At that moment, one of the guys said he had heard something. There were rumors. The Duke, the commander-in-chief's father, sent him alone to Mount Porriket, teeming with monsters, to convince him of his son's genius. And from that moment on, he became an outstanding swordsman. The knight was shocked that the Duke had sent his son despite the possibility of his death. If anyone had to die, he wanted the vice commander dead. The magician, who continued to silently listen to all this nonsense, could not restrain herself. Chloe wondered where Espen had gone, as everyone around her was going crazy and everything was getting weird. Meanwhile, the action shifts to our heroes. By this point, Zenok has finally left the training center, and his former teacher has been fired from his job. Our heroine assumed he was probably still in shock, since it turned out the teacher had lied about his career. The fact that he was a knight from another country was also a lie. The teacher was bullied, and soon began to live as a hermit and wander around the village. However, everything was fine once everything calmed down, and this made Espen very happy, but what just jumped into the bush? Noticing this yet again, Zenok was incredibly angry. Espen calmed him down, saying she would talk to him herself. Our heroine approached the bushes and, glancing at Pantheon, asked why he was always hanging around their house. Had he forgotten they weren't on the best of terms? The boy was confused and angrily asked where the night girl was. Espen asked if they were talking about her sister. Pantheon asked what she was talking about. Our heroine said that she and her sister even had similar hair colors. Anyway, she asked him why he needed her. The boy turned his head away shyly and said that he also wanted to study. Espen immediately told him that he wouldn't be able to do this, so after making the verdict, she asked him to leave. If he doesn't disappear from her sight this very minute, then she will help him get out of here. The guy, of course, had heard about her skills, so he decided not to argue with her too much and immediately ran away. The action takes us to Katie, who was told that magicians from the Heavenly Knightly Order would arrive tomorrow. Kate's teacher said that they were probably already very close, so they might arrive even earlier. Of course, the guy passed this information on to Espen, which left the girl incredibly surprised. Were they really coming? Kate laughed and said they would probably actually arrive. Espen decided that what Weavy had done wasn't going to be left unattended. By the way, Is it really possible that someone our heroine knows will arrive? Although it's unlikely that she knows anyone among the current members of the Heavenly Knightly Order. At this time, Lord Aset greeted the guests who had just arrived with a smile on his face. These guests, of course, were the Lords of Magic. The dark-haired man was Maseth, the 6th member of the Celestial Knightly Order. The boy said he had come here to investigate the incident on His Majesty's orders. He asked in surprise whether the anomaly had occurred in this place or somewhere else. The Lord told them that everything was fine, but nothing else out of the ordinary had happened. Maseth replied that it didn't matter, since their job was to investigate. He also added that climate change requires a huge amount of magic, so everything needs to be studied. Lord Aset told them he understood them, so they could feel at home. Privately, he thought it was rather awkward. At that moment, he called for a servant, but the boy accidentally fell to the ground. The Lord apologized, saying that his servant was too clumsy. Maseth smiled coldly and said that everything was fine, but he did not think that he was worthy of serving the members of the Heavenly Knightly Order. At that very moment, the Lord fell silent, unsure what to do. Suddenly, Maseth's assistant noticed something strange behind him. Looking back, he noticed a cute creature running near the flowers and admiring them. Cleary looked at the creature in bewilderment and wondered, "What is it?" At that moment, this animal approached the magicians and even accidentally stepped on their feet. After this, the divine animal smiled sweetly and told the man that he smelled delicious. Cleary picked it up in surprise and began to examine it closely. However, at that very moment, Maseth snatched the animal from his comrade's hands, asking what it was. Despite the animal's pleas to let it go, the man smiled madly and said that there was still something interesting in this area for him to explore. Meanwhile, the action takes us to our heroine, who cried out in bewilderment, saying what she remembered. The mages of the Heavenly Knightly Order who were currently active were familiar to her, because one of these mages was Chloe's father. Chloe, in turn, was a mage of the Heavenly Knights Order, ranked 10th. She was Espen's only friend. Our heroine remembers how the girl told us that her father was a member of the Order, and she studied hard to be like him. Chloe smiled and said that they even looked almost identical. Meanwhile, Lepus and Weavy were fooling around with each other, when suddenly, Lepus smelled something. He immediately turned to our heroine and told her that a new divine animal had appeared in the town. The rabbit said that he didn't notice him because the guy was hiding his presence. Weavy, as soon as he heard the words that the divine animal was hiding itself, assumed that it was Flea. Our heroine, perplexed, asked them who she was. Weavy and Lepus exchanged glances. Weavy immediately began to sound upset and say she liked people. Lepus, however, said she liked flowers better. Our heroine asked again what they were talking about. Weavy decided to explain to her. He said he was a divine animal, capable of manipulating snow. Flea, on the other hand, dealt with flowers and plants. Their abilities are connected with the environment, and if there are flowers and plants near her, then her strength will increase. Then the guy talked about her character, which was interesting. Our heroine was intrigued, so she decided to ask what was wrong with him. Weavy said that the short answer is that it's best never to make her angry. Meanwhile, Cleary asked Mr. Maseth if he knew what it was. According to the Mage's Code, they cannot touch creatures or objects without knowing their nature. Maseth nevertheless smiled and told Cleary not to dwell on unnecessary thoughts. He asked him to calm down, as he understood everything. Firstly, they certainly shouldn't have worried about the risks. Secondly, since the creature's capture, it hadn't acted up once, but the man even said he knew what it was. It was the divine animal they wrote about in their textbooks. Cleary said in surprise that he seemed to have heard something about them, but was Mr. Maseth really sure that this was a divine animal? The man asked Cleary if she remembered why they were called to this area. An abnormal climate phenomenon. A lot of snow fell here, and this was in the summer. According to the scriptures, divine animals influence nature and climate, but they arrived here unaware that the anomalies were connected specifically to them. Still, he asked to look at this creation, saying that they had living proof in their hands. Placing his hand on Cleary's shoulder, Mr. Maseth told him that they had made, or rather would make, a great discovery. He asked them to simply imagine the powerful magical force lurking within this creature. They'll make history when they disembowel this beast. Maseth also asked not to forget that he is higher than Cleary in the hierarchy, so he reminds that he does not like it when he is contradicted. As soon as Maseth left, Cleary could only think about how greedy the bastard was. A mage's fundamental ethical code is to not harm life you see for the first time. At that very moment, the man heard footsteps behind him, so he turned around and asked who it was. As soon as Cleary turned around, he noticed Reuben, a junior apprentice of the mage Masef, standing behind him. The man asked what had happened. The boy said the teacher asked him to cover the cage. Cleary, looking at the blanket, asked if that was it. Reuben said he thought the animal might freeze. Cleary sighed, saying that his students were too different from himself. Reuben asked Sir Cleary what he was talking about, to which the man replied that he was just thinking out loud. He stroked the boy's head and said he looked at him and remembered his daughter. In any case, he pointed to the cage and advised him to cover it and leave immediately. Shortly after, Mr. Cleary headed for the exit, leaving Reuben alone. At that moment, the guy thought that Mr. Cleary was a very good person who, unlike his teacher, did not hurt him. He even decided that it would be good to study magic with Mr. Cleary. He immediately came to his senses, because it was impossible to desecrate the honor of his teacher. The boy soon grabbed a blanket and headed to the cage to cover the animal. At that moment, the animal looked at the boy and said it was very sweet of him. Reuben even threw the blanket out of his hands at this. The guy, perplexed, asked if she was really talking. However, at that moment, the divine animal looked at the boy and said that he smelled like grass. Soon after, she turned into a human and told the boy that she liked kind people like him. Smiling, she looked at the boy and asked him if he could help her. The guy screamed in bewilderment, and Flea, in turn, flew up to him and poked him in the nose. He instantly turned red as a tomato, which Flea noticed and told him about it. The guy, although stuttering, was able to ask this divine creature who she was. The girl smiled and told him that her name was Flea, and she was looking for her friends. She immediately asked him if he'd seen creatures like her. He said he hadn't, as he'd only just arrived in town. Flea immediately realized he was an outsider. In any case, Flea continued to smile sweetly and ask if a kind person would help her find her friends. The guy just wanted to say something when, suddenly, at that moment, he heard a creaking door. Reuben turned around and was horrified that the teacher had decided to return so soon. The guy started telling the girl that he agreed, but before that, he asked her to return to her previous form. Reuben told her that if the teacher saw that she had taken on human form, he could immediately begin experimenting on her. Flea decided not to argue with the man, so in a moment she turned into a cute and fluffy animal. Soon the girl contacted Reuben and thanked the man for agreeing to help her. The action takes us to our heroes. Espen and Zenok have stepped out into a field and are looking into the forest. Our heroine soon said that this was the very place where they first met. They hadn't been here for a while. Meanwhile, Weavy told Espen that Flea really loved trees and flowers. There was a very good chance she was in a place with lots of plants. However, at that moment, Lepus spoke to them and said that he had lost all sense of Flea again. He only knew that she was somewhere on this planet. Zenok suddenly suggested they search the forest. What if she was there? Weavy agreed, saying it was entirely possible. Soon, they finally set out for the forest. Espen was glad they'd found the trail, but where the hell were they going to find the divine animal? Incidentally, at that moment, she looked at Zenok in surprise and wondered, had he always been this tall? In any case, the girl asked him to search the area. In turn, she ordered Weavy and Lepus to head in the other direction. After a while, everyone was busy, trying to find Flea in any place they could hide. Zenok would never have thought that together, where he met Espen, they would be looking for the divine animal together. At that moment, the guy approached her and asked if she had a last name. Espen, surprised, asked him again. The girl immediately remembered the past, in which she still lived in the estate with her family, before everything that happened. The girl said that only aristocrats have status and, accordingly, a surname, and she is a commoner. Her answer upset him a little, but he still approached her and asked her in surprise how she felt about a wedding between commoners and aristocrats. Espen, of course, was a little surprised by such a blunt question, but she said that if a couple liked each other, she didn't see a problem. But why did he suddenly ask her about it? One way or another, having heard the answer from Espen, the guy was incredibly happy, and at that moment, his eyes even sparkled. The action, meanwhile, takes us to Weavy and Lepus, who is saying that she doesn't understand hints at all. At that moment, Zenok told Espen that he wanted to know about her homeland. The girl asked why so suddenly. The guy looked away, saying that he still didn't really know anything about her, so he would like to get to know her more. Espen knew she had to give some kind of answer to his question. but it was still difficult to do so. Moments from her past, in which she lay defenseless on the ground, began to appear before her eyes again. While she could do nothing, her estate, or rather her parents' estate, simply burned to the ground. Returning from these terrible memories, the girl said that her relatives were very far away from here. Anyway, she decided to change the subject, saying that she felt like the divine animal wasn't there, so it was time to go back. Having already set off back, our heroine began to think that they would most likely need Katie's help. The action moves to the city where the guys finally met. Looking at Weavy, the girl asked if they'd found anything. Maybe some clues? Weavy just shook his head. Espin then assumed that Flea wasn't in the forest at all, or perhaps very deep in it. Weavy suddenly asked the man what was for dinner tonight. However, at that moment, shouts began to ring out in front of them. Someone was shouting and saying that it would be better to help them think. The man, by the way, did not particularly notice what was happening in front of him, so he crashed into Espin simply because he did not notice her. The man, perplexed, grabbed the girl and prevented her from falling, then apologized and asked if she was okay. Our heroine, as soon as she opened her eyes, noticed a man in front of her who looked very much like Chloe. Cleary, meanwhile, asked Espin if she was hurt. In any case, he was a mage with healing magic. At that very moment, the man raised his wand and used magic on Espin. A few seconds later, he asked the unknown girl if she was feeling better. Espin was still confused, but managed to say that she was feeling better. Cleary was very happy to hear this, but still apologized again. He was in a hurry anyway, so he wouldn't be able to keep an eye on her at all. Turning his head back, he told her that if she got sick again, she could come to the Lord's castle, and his name was Cleary. Finally, he stroked her head, telling her that she was cute and that his daughter was about the same age. After that, he left, but at the same time, he continued waving his hand for a long time. Zinuk looked at Espin in surprise, thinking that this was the first time he had seen her like this. Despite our heroine's dejection, Weavy approached her with a very important question. He asked the man where they would eat. Zinuk decided to ask what happened, to which the girl said that everything was fine. He just met someone she knew. Without thinking twice, she suggested that he follow this mage. Zinuk wasn't particularly opposed. Confused, Weavy started screaming and reminding people about food. Our heroine asked him to be patient for a little while and that they would soon return home for food. Meanwhile, our heroine still followed the two magicians, and, strangely enough, they came to the Lord's castle. Also looking at Cleary and the man standing next to her, she noticed their robes, which undoubtedly indicated that they were royal mages. However, our heroine thought correctly, since this magician whom she met is indeed Chloe's father. However, reminiscing about the past, Chloe told Espin that her father died when she was a child. He went to work and never came back. Our heroine realized with horror that she had now encountered one of the terrifying moments for a time traveler. Right now, she met a man who was dead in her past. She immediately wondered, could the incident that happened here have caused Chloe's father's death? In any case, she said it was time to go back. Our heroes immediately headed home, but Lepus, for some unknown reason, thoughtfully watched the palace. They eventually returned home and told Cade about meeting the royal mages, which surprised him. Soon the boy said that if these mages were stationed in the Lord's castle, then everything was clear. Our heroine asked him again, surprised. Cade explained that right now there was a very powerful energy coming from the palace, which he felt. Usually, mages who come here on business are housed in ordinary houses, but this time everything was different. The guy immediately said that he was sure that something or someone was being hidden in the Lord's castle. Espin immediately guessed who it was. Cade nodded and said yes. The divine beast could be found there. Lepus joined the conversation and said that he also felt something coming from the castle. Our heroine, of course, immediately began hugging him and asking, perplexed, why he'd remained silent until now. The rabbit replied that he wasn't entirely sure, just being captured by Flea's people. She could have asked him for help, but she did not do this, although she definitely felt his presence, so he did not say anything. Our heroine immediately jumped up, slammed the table, and declared that this wouldn't do. They would go to the castle tomorrow to see for themselves. She glanced at Cade and asked if he'd help them. He smiled and said that if she wanted to investigate, he was all for it, as it would be fun. However, immediately afterward, he mentioned that they had a problem. There were 2 royal mages, and they lived in different places. He and his teacher greeted them. That's why he thinks they will need to explore both places, but it will be impossible to do it in just one day. The 2 mages' homes are located a long distance from each other, and he also noticed that the protective barrier is strengthened in the laboratory, but this is normal near mages' homes. Our heroine immediately asked what if they split into groups and each explored their own territory. Kate said that sounded good, but how would they communicate? Espen said that if Lepus was at a distance, she would know what he was doing. So Lepus, Weavy, and Zenok would go together. In turn, our heroine will go with Katie, and they will search in the castle, and the 3 of them must explore the dwelling of the magicians. Zenok was very depressed, because he really wanted to go to the castle with Espen. Our heroine approached him at that moment and asked if he remembered the mage they'd seen earlier. She wanted them to follow him. Taking her hand, Zenok said that he would fulfill her request, but asked her not to get too close to Katie, because he wanted her to be friends only with him. Sometimes Espen still didn't understand what he was talking about. Anyway, she surprisingly agreed and told him that he was the closest to her. And yet, for some reason unknown to her, she blushed deeply, without even understanding why. Zenok smiled because he was glad that Espen also wanted to be friends with him. At this point, Katie intervened in their conversation and said that this was too much, because he would also like to be friends with Espen. At that moment, an awkward pause fell between them. While Katie smiled, Zenok followed him with his terrifying gaze. Our heroine, in turn, turned her head from side to side in bewilderment and did not understand what this gloomy atmosphere was. Leaving aside this strange incident, the action still takes us to the next day, when our heroine was already ready to go to the castle. Looking at Katie, she told him she had hopes for him. He smiled at her and said everything would be fine. The girl then glanced at the group that included Zenok. She asked Lepus and Weavy not to screw up too much. Immediately after all the orders were given, our heroine used magic to make a high jump and flew over the fence. After some time, Espen and Katie were in the building and tried not to reveal themselves. Zenok, Weavy, and Lepus walked around the castle just as carefully. At that moment, Katie told our heroine that the second team didn't have a mage, so he wanted to know if everything would be okay. Espen said Lepus was with them. The rabbit promised to help her. She angrily began telling him that they had work to do to find the divine animal, so he had to join in. At that moment, Lord Aseta appeared on the horizon and began to speak in bewilderment about how all magicians were gloomy. His servant tried to calm his master, saying that the mages were on the residence grounds. The man replied that they wouldn't be here today, so he could say whatever he wanted. Those mages asked for the entire laboratory building, not to mention the best room in the castle, so he had to give up his own. Damn royal mages. He then asked the servant if there was any news from the Black Knights. Espen was incredibly shocked to hear this. The servant, however, said there was no news. After some time, they came to a certain place. Our heroine dared to guess that this place was the laboratory. Without thinking twice, she suggested going there, so they headed straight there. But suddenly, Espen stopped Katie, saying that there was a magical barrier here that couldn't be easily passed through. He explained that as soon as they entered the barrier zone, an alarm would go off. He could do something, but Espen would have to remain under invisibility magic for now. At that very moment, our heroine heard someone's voices nearby, so she decided to listen. The aristocrats talked about the difficulties with the mages and hoped they would leave soon. They also noticed animal cries coming from the laboratory at night. At that moment, Espen and Katie were in the closet as the aristocrats walked past. As soon as the voices became barely audible, our heroine assumed they had passed. She asked Katie if he could use his magic here. However, raising her head, she noticed Katie standing close in front of her. Looking at his amber eyes in bewilderment, the girl said that they were very beautiful. The guy smiled and said that he was pleased, but nevertheless, she was also beautiful. A moment later, they were heading toward the lab. Kate told Espen that the further they went, the stronger the barrier would become. The invisibility magic might wear off. Our heroine, however, was not going there just like that, so she turned around and said that she had an idea. A couple of minutes later, she was standing there disguised as a maid. If they were at risk of being caught, it was better to appear in this guise, and then they might be able to get away with it. In turn, Katie turned into a stately aristocrat who still looked very handsome. The guy immediately asked the girl how she liked the result. He was capable of creating an image he'd never seen before, so he chose his father's image. In turn, She immediately realized that this is how he saw her during the battle with Seductive, when Lepus made her an adult. However, at that moment the guy said that, in fact, it was not the first time he had seen her in such a guise. He had already watched her from the sky, and he was very interested in her. Looking at Espen, a man of power, he asked where she came from. Why was she seeking divine animals? Who was she? After touching her curls, the guy said that he wanted to know absolutely everything about her. Meanwhile, the action moves to the laboratory, where Ruben was looking after Flea, who really wanted to look at the flowers, so she wanted to go out. The guy, looking at her, immediately became thoughtful. Every such question from her left him stumped. He didn't know what to do since his teacher wasn't there, but the teacher had said he'd be gone for a while. Perhaps there was a connection between them. Would everything be okay? The boy decided to tell her he could take her to the garden. Unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to take her outside the castle. Flea was excited that they could go for a walk, so she instantly turned into a human and said that it was time to have fun. A short time later, they found themselves in the garden. Ruben watched Flea, who in turn was enjoying the green meadow. Soon the girl began to create flowers around and scatter them in different directions. Ruben was now both perplexed and delighted, so he immediately asked if it was magic. Flea replied that it was something similar to her. Meanwhile, the action takes us to Weevy and Lepus, who suddenly stare at the sky. Lepus immediately reported that Flea had cut off contact. Weevy then assumed she was having fun. Anyway, Lepus told him that the main thing is that she doesn't get angry or aggressive. At this time, Seductive was thinking about how he wanted to successfully complete the task that Espen had given him. The most important thing he wanted was to get closer to her, because she was the only one he needed. He wanted to be with her for a long time. The guy immediately remembered her words about her homeland being very far from here. A question popped into his head. What if Espen decided to leave? Would he be allowed to follow her if that was his intention? Looking down, he also asked why he couldn't go with her if she still refused. However, his thoughts were interrupted because right now Cleary appeared in front of them, looking shocked. Looking at the dark-haired guy with red eyes, he immediately remembered the moment he met the girl he accidentally touched. Cleary immediately turned to Seductive, telling him that if he wasn't mistaken, he was with the pink-haired girl. Was he right? Seductive, in turn, remembered Espen's words that magicians have excellent memories. So if he meets Cleary, he will recognize him for sure. But for such an occasion, our heroine has prepared something, so he will need to say something. At this point, the action shifts back to Ruben and Flea, who are currently weaving wreaths. The boy suddenly looked at the girl and reminded her that she told him that she needed to find friends. Nevertheless, Flea smiled and, placing the wreath on his head, said that everything was fine because she had already found them. She stared at the castle and said that perhaps they were in the city, or maybe even in this castle. Ruben looked at her in surprise and asked if she missed them. The girl approached him and told him not to think about anything else, because now she enjoyed spending time with him. The boy was very happy to hear this. However, at that moment, he decided to bring up the idea of taking her outside the castle. However, he didn't have time to finish speaking, because right now, an unknown person stood in front of them. Raising his head, the boy discovered in horror that it was the teacher, so he reflexively jumped up from the ground and covered Flea. The man looked at the student in bewilderment and asked him why he wasn't doing what he told him to. He was also curious about who the girl was and why she was there. However, at that moment, he decided to take a closer look at her and was horrified to discover that she resembled that very divine animal. Could it really be her? Instantly, the man began to laugh madly without stopping, and soon he asked the divine animal if she could really transform into a human. Maseth looked more and more like an excellent experimental subject with every word and every second. Realizing what would follow, Ruben fell to his knees and began to beg the teacher not to do what he had planned. The man told him that he was too talkative for an ordinary shepherd boy who raised an animal. Ruben nevertheless recalled that the teacher himself said that he would not conduct experiments on people. The man told him to shut up and then asked him if he was even a human being. Maseth told her to listen carefully. This animal is a monster in human form. It doesn't matter if he uses her as he pleases. Looking at the student, he asked how he dared lecture him. Ruben pressed himself against the teacher's leg, and the teacher told him he was a useless brat. At that very moment, Maseth raised his hand as he was about to punish his disobedient lab assistant. However, he was unable to do this, because an unknown force threw him to the ground. Raising his head, he noticed Flea, who was seriously angry. Looking at the man, the divine animal told him she didn't like him. A moment later, vines began to fly past him, cutting his body. Soon after, Master Maseth was bound. He, in turn, began laughing in bewilderment and asking what kind of magic this was. Just at that very moment, Espen and Kade came running into the garden, clearly surprised at what was going on there. At this point, Maseth was still screaming and ordering them to let him go. However, Flea's rash attack also caught Reuben, who was being slammed by a deadly vine. Of course, our heroine couldn't let Reuben be captured, so she cut the vine and asked if he was okay. The guy, horrified, began to say that he needed help because his girlfriend. After the word girlfriend, our heroine stopped hearing him. Turning her head, our heroine noticed a girl in front of her who looked crazy. Espen immediately turned to her and asked if she was right in thinking she was a divine animal. She felt she had overdone it with her magic, since her friend had suffered because of it. At that very moment, Flea seemed to come to her senses, because she noticed that Reuben, whom she wanted to protect, ended up suffering because of her. Our heroine, in turn, told her to get away from there, and she would deal with this scoundrel magician herself. Flea decided to obey, but at that very moment, Maseth was freed and immediately began to attack. However, Kade came to Espen's defense, raising his wand to block the attack. Maseth watched in horror as this happened, wondering how this guy was able to block his magic. However, Espen, who was standing behind him, decided to show him everything with her fingers, so after a while he was lying unconscious. By the way, at that moment, the girl suddenly realized that she had no time left at all. Flea, meanwhile, approached Reuben and began apologizing, saying that she had briefly lost her mind. Our heroine nevertheless intervened in their conversation and said they needed to leave and that she hoped they didn't want to linger. Incidentally, Weavy and Lepus were waiting for her. Espen also asked Flea to take a friend with her so they could treat him. The girl happily hugged Reuben and told him he was kind. But it couldn't be that simple, because at that very moment of climax, Cleary appeared, perplexed, and asked what was going on. The man noticed Maseth lying on the ground, so he immediately turned his gaze to Espen. At first, however, he didn't realize it was her, because the girl was an adult, so he asked who she was. Espen's heart sank, but to her great happiness, everything turned out much better, because at that moment she noticed Zenok, who was standing behind Cleary. Realizing that he had told most of the story, our heroine breathed a sigh of relief. The girl told him a little more, which of course surprised Cleary, but he still began to examine what was happening with his eyes. The next person he saw was a guy with blonde hair, who, apparently, was a student of the great magician. After that, Cleary raised his cane and deactivated their magic. Cade laughed, saying they'd been found out. However, Cleary was not amused, so the man warned them that if they did not reveal their identities, he would have to report them as trespassers. Our heroine was surprised by these words, because she had given Zenok the task of telling everything to Teacher Cleary if he met him. That's why the girl looked at the teacher in surprise and asked if they hadn't told him anything. They were Chloe's friends. The man sighed heavily, but soon after he invited the boys to go inside and talk. After a while, they found themselves at the same table, while Maseth was still tied up and lying on the floor. The divine animals, in turn, finally recovered, although a few were still missing. At that moment, Cleary looked at Espen in surprise and asked if she was his daughter's friend. Our heroine confidently said yes, backing it up with the fact that she lived in Roostfield for a time. Incidentally, this is Chloe's birthplace. The girl must be about 11 years old now, and Cleary can't even imagine how much she talked about him, about her father. She said that he was an outstanding royal magician, and, moreover, thanks to her, she learned what the uniform of the Knights of the Heavenly Order looked like. And also, at their first meeting, she immediately realized that he was her father, because she looked so much like him. She's right? The man was even embarrassed by these words. It was all true after all, but Chloe is very shy, so he didn't know she could say such things about him. However, our heroine said that if Cleary does not believe her, then she can tell him something that only he can know. Smiling, our heroine said that Chloe has a talent for magic, but she is not yet ready to reveal it, so she continues to live peacefully. Our heroine said that she and Chloe never had any secrets. However, these words truly sealed the deal. The man immediately realized that she was indeed friends with Chloe, but this could also be understood without even using lie detection magic. Espen was a little surprised, but but she still remembered that Chloe's father was just as good at mental magic. She remembers Chloe telling her about it, and that her father can easily spot any lie. Espin knew that if Chloe hadn't told her about her father's skills, she would have been pulling the wool over his eyes. Anyway, at that moment, the man asked if he understood correctly that they had come here to save the divine animal. Espin said it was all true. Cleary then glanced at her friend and asked if she had really sent him to help them if something happened. Our heroine laughed and said he was right. Besides, she thought that if he saw the other divine animals, he'd believe in her good intentions. The man suddenly became thoughtful. He knew Espin wasn't lying to him, but something still seemed odd. He didn't understand why. While talking to this little girl named Espin, he had the feeling that he was interrogating a knight. In any case, he still decided to ask them what they were going to do next. After all, Mr. Maceth, whom they met earlier, is by nature a very greedy person. If he takes a fancy to some interesting object, he will not let it go, even if he has to destroy them all with his own hands. Espin still didn't understand why he was hunting divine animals. The boy said they'd been informed of anomalous phenomena in the area. Espin said she understood him, and soon after, she looked at Mr. Cleary in surprise and asked if he was interested in the power of divine animals. The man said he wasn't interested at all, and then, perplexed, asked who Mr. Cleary was. He said they could just call him Uncle. A memory immediately popped into my head when Chloe said her father was too kind and honest. She even thought that was why he died. Our heroine lowered her head and said with sadness in her soul that her father was exactly as she said. However, at that moment, our heroine turned to him and asked him to keep what happened today a secret. The man nodded his head and said that everything would be fine, and that he would take care of everything. Espin was grateful, but asked what if he got into trouble. Cleary said he couldn't ignore his daughter's friend, who might get into trouble. The man said that for the sake of his beloved daughter, he is ready to keep even the most terrible secret. He also said that he hadn't seen Chloe for a long time, and he was ashamed that he didn't even know her friend's name. In any case, he said that if he helped her, then he and Chloe would spend a lot of time together talking about what happened. Our heroine, of course, was very unhappy about this, but then she realized that she would no longer be here when he met Chloe again. Anyway, at that moment, the man turned to the boys and said that he was going to interfere with Mr. Maceth's memory. After a while, it was time to say goodbye. Before leaving, Cleary glanced at Caden, remembering that he was the apprentice of a great mage. The man said he wanted to ask him something. Continuing to look into Cade's eyes, the man assumed he was going to tell his teacher. After a while, the action shifts to the building where Katie lives. As soon as he entered the room, someone spoke to him. As it turned out, it was the teacher who told the boy that he had recently started disappearing frequently. The guy smiled and said that there were so many interesting things in this town that he had completely lost his mind. The man said that was understandable, since he was at an age where everything was interesting. In any case, he asked the student if he had found what he was looking for. He added that he was talking about something related to time. The guy went to hang up his robe and said he was still searching. After all, he reminded them that this was, after all, the reason they had come here. In any case, he turned to the teacher again. He asked about the thing they were looking for. Did it have to be a thing, or could it be a person? Still, the teacher asked me to tell him about a person with strange magic if he met one. The man said it was definitely possible that their target might be a human. A power capable of manipulating time is very strange and remains a mystery. He said that this was why Katie had to find its source, and as soon as he discovered something similar, he asked to let him know. The boy smiled and told the teacher that he would do the same if he noticed something strange. The action takes us back to when Cleary asked Caden if he was going to tell his teacher everything. At that moment, the guy said that he didn't really know what to do, so he asked what he should do. The man suddenly asked him if these people were his friends. If so, he advised him to simply be a good friend. It was these words that had a great impact on him and made him think about a lot of things. Anyway, the action takes us to Espin, who screamed in surprise and asked if Flea really knew the location of one of the divine animals. Flea smiled and said that it was true. She knew it very well because she was good friends with him. Weavy snorted in bewilderment, saying that it wasn't strange, since they were always sticking to each other and walking around like that. Our heroine, despite their local problems, decided to ask why they split up. Flea explained that she wanted to find fire and lightning, but she doesn't like that at all. Espin was naturally surprised. She assumed Flea knew where she was anyway, so she wanted to know where the last divine animal was. Flea said she could help, but unfortunately, she didn't know the names of places in this world. In that case, Zinok decided to ask what if he showed the location on a map. Flea said he could try that. Soon, she had a huge map of the continent in front of her, where her friend could be located. Flea stood thoughtfully, looking at the map, while Zinok and Espen waited faithfully. After some time of thought, the divine animal finally pointed his finger at the map, saying that it was most likely located there. Our heroine, having seen the location of the last divine animal, fell into a stupor. The problem with all of this was that Flea had just pointed out the place where Espen was born. Zinok immediately noticed that Espen's expression had changed, but he couldn't understand why. One way or another, at that very moment, she seemed to come to her senses and began to talk about something. The action soon shifts to night. Inside the house, the wood was quietly crackling in the fireplace, and the divine animals, like Zinok, were resting. Only our heroine, for some unknown reason, sat and watched the stars through the open window. At that moment, Lepus flew up to her, suggesting that she couldn't sleep. Espen immediately said that the divine animal was where her home used to be. What if she encountered her past self? Lepus told her that she had to avoid her, and that she had to do it for her own sake. She didn't just want to disappear, did she? The girl said she couldn't go there. As Weavy had said, they would have to lure the divine animal. At that very moment, our heroine noticed something strange on the street. For some unknown reason, Zinok was also awake and outside. Our heroine assumed that something had happened to him, so she threw a blanket over herself and decided to go outside. Yet at that moment, all she saw was a beautiful picture, the incredibly beautiful Zinok against the backdrop of an equally beautiful starry sky. Espen looked at him with admiration in her eyes, and even fleetingly called him Commander. Hearing someone's voice, the guy turned around in surprise and asked Espen what she was doing there. Espen laughed awkwardly, suggesting that she had accidentally said something wrong. Zinok was nonetheless surprised that she called him Commander. It was strange. Anyway, our heroine looked at Zinok and asked why he wasn't sleeping. The guy said he has too much on his mind, so he sometimes goes outside to freshen up. But what about her? Espen said that, to tell the truth, she couldn't sleep either. But when she saw him, all her thoughts disappeared. He scared her. At that moment, Zinok looked at the ground and asked Espen if she would leave here. Our heroine thought for a moment, and soon said that this was not out of the question, since there were no more divine animals here. At this point, the guy looked at her and asked if he could go with her. Espen said he obviously couldn't do that. Zinok took her hand and asked why. The guy said that he doesn't want to break up with her, and moreover, he wants to follow her. Soon after, he looked away shyly and said that he thought he liked her. Espen immediately screamed in confusion, asking him what he was talking about. Because of such abruptness, Zinok even became confused and soon began to say that he meant that he liked her as a friend. Our heroine immediately seemed to come to her senses and, starting to laugh, began to pat him on the back. The guy, of course, didn't expect such a reaction to his confession, so he was a little downcast. Espen knew that if she left him alone, the only person who would support him would be his maid. Moreover, she even thought about the fact that he might be bullied again. After weighing the pros and cons, our heroine, to Zinok's surprise, told him he could go with her. He happily agreed. After this, Espen decided to ask him if he had ever been on a picnic. Our heroine asked him in surprise if he'd actually never gone on a picnic even when he was traveling. He said it was true. The action shifts to the next morning. Our heroine, with great difficulty, wakes up and gets out of bed. She immediately headed to the bathroom to wash up, but as she passed the mirror, she noticed something with her peripheral vision. Turning back to look at her reflection, the girl screamed in horror, asking what had happened to her face. Our heroine realized that she hadn't gotten enough sleep, which upset her greatly. Soon, the image of Zinok confessing to her that he liked her came back to her mind. She bit her finger anxiously, thinking that it simply couldn't be that he liked her in the way she thought he did. And again, she decided that this was nonsense, because when you give birth to children, they consider the one they see for the first time to be their mother. That's why she decided that Zinok was attracted to her because he admired her and thought she was cool. By the way, she suddenly thought that he could admire her as much as she admired the commander. And again, the memory of Zinok looking at Espen and asking if everything went well yesterday appeared before her eyes. The girl began to scream in bewilderment, thinking about when these thoughts would disappear from her head. Meanwhile, Zenok continued to stare thoughtfully at the floor, thinking about Espen calling him Commander yesterday. He was certain that was exactly what she had called him. Soon after, he drew two parallels, realizing that his father was the commander of the Knights. The guy immediately looked at Weavy and asked him if he knew where Espen's homeland was. The lamb said that he did not know, but Lepus in turn replied that he knew. He proudly mentioned that Espen had previously lived in the capital. He was confident in his help. However, Zenok, perplexed, said that this wasn't her homeland. Lepus in turn said that it wasn't because she lived there that it was her fault. Soon after a short pause, he added that she lived there until her death. Of course. Zenok jumped up from his chair at this information and immediately asked Lepus what he was talking about, but the rabbit said that he couldn't tell him more. Meanwhile, the action shifts to our heroine, who came to the village to meet Katie. By the way, they were just together, and the guy asked Espen in surprise if she was really going to leave the city. Espen told him that she was indeed planning to leave here for a short while. In any case, she took his hand and thanked him, saying that she didn't know if they would be able to meet, but he should know that he was a good friend. Soon after, they said goodbye and Espen started to leave, but Katie suddenly stopped her. The boy remembered the words of the teacher, who told him that their target could even be a person. That's why, knowing she was unusual, he asked her, could he go with them? Meanwhile, the action shifts to Zenok, who has taken out his suitcase, thinking that he needs to take the most important things with him on the road. At that very moment, a maid burst into the room, telling the gentleman that someone had arrived to see him. At that very moment, a young man entered the room, bowed before His Highness, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The action takes us again, but this time to the palace of Countessette. The man was reading a letter lying on the table in horror. He soon ran to the servant with the letter and asked if what was written there was true. The servant replied that most likely the Black Knight had indeed arrived at the estate. The action shifts back a week to the Duchy of Black Knight. A man standing by the window asks if his son has finally emerged. Cassian, also the second-ranking knight and second in command, said that it was so. The man was glad to hear this, because he had already begun to think that this puppy was no longer good for anything. He soon said that, as far as he knew, Cleary and Maseth had gone to the Lord. Cassian again told the commander that he was right. As always, Cessnack Black Knight stood before us, the Duke and current commander of the Celestial Knightly Order. The man paused for a moment and looked into the distance. Soon he asked if he should visit his son. Cassian was very surprised by what he had just heard with his own ears, so he asked again in surprise. Cessnack told him he'd heard correctly. He was heading there personally. The drive would take about a week. Meanwhile, Zenok stood in his house and read a letter that said that His Highness Duke Black Knight was on his way here. Nevertheless, the boy clenched the paper and threw it on the ground. The maid, surprised, asked the gentleman what had happened. The guy, in turn, told her to throw away the letter, and they would pretend that he had never received it. The action, meanwhile, takes us to the village, just at the moment when Katie asked if he could go with them. Our heroine asked him in surprise, and also asked why he needed it. The guy said he just wanted to be close. Espen still didn't understand why. At that very moment, Kate took her hand and, pulling her toward him, told her he liked her. Now our heroine was in incredible shock and completely lost touch with this world. She immediately started thinking, so does that mean he's a mage who will confess his feelings to her in the future? Our heroine soon realized that this was nonsense, because he was just a child, just like Zenok. Espen smiled and assumed he meant that he liked her as a friend, right? The guy laughed and said that wasn't true at all. He liked her differently, and he might even kiss her. The guy soon apologized, thinking that he should have said that he wanted to kiss her, or maybe he should have said nothing at all? Espen started screaming and telling him that he was too young and that he had too many hormones. The guy apologized again, assuming that she didn't like it at all. But in that case, he promised that he would improve for her sake. Immediately after this, he put her hand to his face and asked what kind of person she would like. Our heroine was shocked. She couldn't even imagine that the great magician had been like this as a child. Espen told him that her type was definitely not his. Kate laughed, saying that was very harsh. In any case, The guy asked to go with her. He was sure he would be useful. After some time, the action moves to Zenok's home, who at this moment, in bewilderment, asks what happened. Espen introduced Kade, saying that he was the person joining their trip. The guy, perplexed, asked why they needed him. Espen, surprised, said she thought it would be more convenient with a mage. She also reminded them that they were going there alone, without adults, and Katie would help them resolve situations where they needed an adult's presence. Zenok then reminded her that she could become an adult herself, just like back then. Espen said that was true, but sometimes they might need identification. Just at that moment, Kate intervened in the conversation and said that this is exactly what he could do. In that case, Zenok also decided to bring out the big guns. The guy said he could arrange a pass for them because he was a duke. Now it was a life or death competition, and also a matter of whether they needed Kate on the trip. The divine animals weren't surprised that the human world was interesting. Flea was very curious about what would happen next. Espen suddenly asked if everything would be okay, because if he were outside the estate, his father would find out about everything. The guy was immediately upset, knowing she was telling the truth. That's why Espen had suggested taking Kate with her. At that moment, Flea approached Kate and asked in surprise if he too was a divine animal. Weavy told his friend that he wasn't, because he was a human and a mage. Meanwhile, our heroine, for some unknown reason, sat and looked ahead with a sad expression. Zenok noticed this, so he decided to disturb her to ask why she was sad. Our heroine turned around and asked in surprise if that's really what she looked like. In any case, the point is that the place they were going to was close to her homeland. As soon as Zenok heard these words, he immediately assumed that she did not want to go there. Espen, in turn, said that she, on the contrary, really wants to go there, but unfortunately, she simply cannot. Soon after, she turned to him and said that what she had just told him was a secret. The guy looked at her embarrassedly and said that he wouldn't tell anyone about it. Espen immediately moved away and, clearing her throat, said that they were leaving in 2 days. Although she said this quite confidently, she still really hoped that nothing would happen. Meanwhile, the action takes us to the road along which the convoy was now traveling. Of course, it was a convoy with the royal carriage, with Cessnack inside. He asked how much longer they had left. Kaysen told him it was 2 days' journey to the estate. The action moves forward 2 days later, just as our heroes were finishing their preparations and getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a maid entered the room and told the mistress that she had a guest. Opening the door, she noticed Mr. Cleary standing in front of her. The man, perplexed, said that he had already asked to be called Uncle. Noticing that they were getting ready to leave, he asked where they were going. Our heroine told him they needed to get away for a while. However, he looked at the girl's luggage and said that her luggage did not look like they were going for a short time. That's why he assumed they were leaving town. Espen laughed and said they were leaving town, that's right. Then the girl said that they were going to go to the Shua estate. Cleary was surprised, firstly because they were going alone, and secondly because it was quite far. Espen said they needed to get there. And regarding the adult, she said that it's true that he's not around, but they can still manage on their own. Nevertheless, Mr. Cleary said he would help them. Espen asked about his work, to which he replied that while he had work to do, he couldn't get any work done for now. The man said his and Maseth's business trip would be a bit longer. Meanwhile, he was suffering from the side effects of the memory-wiping magic. And again, our heroine asked him if he was sure, to which the man said that Maseth was the person in charge, so he should finish everything himself. After all, it was he who was sent to this city to explore the area, and he went with him as an assistant. By the way, at this moment, Cleary said that Duke Black Knight was now heading there. Zenok asked when he would arrive, to which his uncle said that he would arrive soon. Our heroine immediately noticed how quickly Zenok's face changed, so she realized that their relationship was very bad. The guy immediately ran to Espen and started telling her that they should hit the road as soon as possible. Cleary asked in surprise what was going on, and Espen said that, in general, Zenok was right, because it was time for them to go. The man asked why there was such a rush, to which our heroine replied that she thought the boy didn't particularly want to see his father. Mr. Cleary was shocked to hear these words. Surely he hadn't misheard, and Espen had said, "Father?" He looked at Zenok and asked if he was the commander's son. Espen laughed and answered for him, saying it was true. Coming closer, he told Zenok that he really did look like his father, but he couldn't understand why he didn't want to see his father. Our heroine again said that most likely there are reasons for this, and she respects his decisions. At this point, Cleary looked at the divine animals and said, that he would help them with this. To be more precise, the man said that he would stall for a little time so that they could escape. After some time, Commander Black Knight arrived in the village and walked along the path to his son. On the way, he was met by Cleary and Lord Asset. They both greeted the commander, mentioning that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Cessnack immediately asked Cleary where Maseth had gone. The man replied that he wasn't feeling well, so he'd be taking his place. With a heavy sigh, the commander said that Maseth was apparently shirking his duties again. However, Cleary understood that his comrade's condition truly left much to be desired. Anyway, the guy smiled, telling the commander that he needed to show him something. The man turned around in surprise and asked if it was really so important to show it now. Cleary said it was truly important, so it was worth showing now. Cessnack sighed heavily and agreed, suggesting he had time for it. Meanwhile, Cade was already standing in place of the meeting that they had discussed as a group. At that very moment, he noticed a tired Espen, who apparently was running towards him. She immediately told him everything that was happening. Cade summed it up, saying that, as far as he understood, they had to leave the city without anyone finding out. Espen said he was great and that he'd gotten it right, but she also said that plans had changed, so they needed to leave right now. That wouldn't be a problem, would it? The guy laughed and said that he certainly had no problem with that, because he was already ready to go. So they left. The evening was slowly approaching, and the sun was setting behind the horizon. It was at this time that Cessnack arrived to visit his son, but, of course, there was no one inside the house anymore. Casion, noticing this, immediately realized things were bad. Cessnack was furious. He ordered his son to be found immediately. Once again, the action shifts to the moment when our heroine said they needed to leave early. The guy agreed, but asked if there was really a reason for the rush. At that very moment, Espen looked back and noticed 2 knights of the Heavenly Order behind her. The girl immediately turned to the boys and, bringing them to their senses, said that they needed to go to the gate immediately because they didn't have time. Cade said at this point that if he understood correctly, then they only needed to go outside the gate. Our heroine nodded her head, and soon after, the magician took her hand, saying that they should hold on tighter. At that very moment, he waved his wand, and they soared into the sky. Espen was shocked by such abruptness. From the knight's point of view, at that moment, this only looked like something strange, so they didn't even attach any importance to it. Meanwhile, the boys were still flying through the sky. Espen was in incredible shock, but Zenak calmed down, as it wasn't as scary as he thought. However, he immediately remembered his father. He was sure his father would soon realize he was out of town and would be angry. Anyway, looking at Espen again, the guy decided that everything would be fine because she was nearby. Flying through the sky beyond the village's borders, the boy finally felt a sense of freedom. Espen was his savior, and he didn't want to leave her side. Soon the action takes us to the commander of Cessnack, who was perplexed by the fact that his son was not at the estate, but he sent the servants home. Looking at Count Asset, he asked in surprise how he had managed to keep an eye on Zinok. At this time, Cleary was incredibly happy that he had bought some time for Espen and the others. However, the magician didn't even think that the commander would order him to find his son. The man wondered if he should help in the search, and how. Or should he go against the commander? One way or another, looking at Count Asset, he decided that first of all, he needed to make sure that he didn't kill anyone. He then turned his gaze to the window, where the sunset was already setting. Cleary wondered how far away the children were. Meanwhile, the action takes us to the forest, where our heroes have set up camp. As a result, the divine animals rested after such a journey, and a delicious soup was being prepared in the cauldron. Our heroine was amazed by Kata's cooking skills, so she told him that she had no idea he could cook so well. The boy smiled and said he was very pleased to hear that. He also added that his teacher had taught him this. After that, he mentioned that Espen had told them they needed to get to the Shua estate. But did she have a plan yet? The girl said she was still hesitating. Cade nodded, then asked if they had really fled the city in such a hurry because of Duke Black Knight. Our heroine sighed and said that was true. Afterwards, the boy said he'd seen him once. As far as he remembered, he'd been with his teacher at the time, and the Duke was beating the man as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Zinok and Lepus were peeling onions together, and it even brought tears to their eyes. Overall, it all came out just in time. In any case, our heroine turned to Kade and told him that there are a lot of bad people in the world. Now our heroine understood that Zinok's character had changed due to her father's influence. Soon after, she sat down on the ground, saying that if a person has any problems, then there is always a reason for everything. Katie, perplexed, asked her if she'd just discovered this. He told her that's precisely why you can't trust everyone you meet. You never know what people are hiding. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was talking about himself. The guy laughed and reminded her that he liked her. The girl snorted and asked him not to make her laugh. Katie asked why she didn't believe him, but she reminded him that the food was boiling, so it was time to take the pot off the heat. He immediately did so. After this, Katie turned to Espen again and asked if she could command divine beasts. The girl replied that she had not done so. In that case, he decided to ask how she had assumed the image of her adult self. After all, the magic didn't resemble the one she used. That is why he decided to assume that this was not magic at all, but the skill of a time traveler. Our heroine at that very moment lost the power of speech and did not know what to say to him. However, at that moment, they heard something behind them. They immediately noticed that there was a strange movement in the bushes, which meant that they had guests. Cade wasn't particularly happy about this, but he immediately told the guys that he was going to change their appearances, so they should be prepared. After some time, our heroine regained her adult appearance. And just at that moment, someone approached her. Turning around, our heroine noticed the commander in front of her, which left her incredibly shocked. The action shifts back some time. Sitting by the fire, Kate spoke of how they would meet many people during their journey. The guy said that no one in the city itself would care about them, but there was one problem. Our heroine interrupted him at this point and dared to suggest that things would be different in the forest. The boy said so. In that case, our heroine leaned over and asked Katie to use transformation magic in the strange situation. The girl then asked how long his magic would last, to which Kate replied that, given his abilities, it would last around noon, but if he tried hard enough, it could last all day. In that case, she asked them to use magic until they knew the person they met could be trusted. True, that's what they'd agreed on, but Espen didn't take one thing into account. She nearly had a heart attack, thinking Zenok, in adult form, was his father. She thought Cade would turn him into a completely different person, like Cleary. At this point, Zenok once again noticed that Espen was feeling strange for some reason, so he turned to her and asked if everything was okay. Looking back and seeing Zenok, the memory of him asking her if everything was okay came back to her. Our heroine blushed incredibly, but still said that everything was fine, so she asked him to move away. The guy was upset that she was reacting this way to his touches, but he still did not resist. Just at that moment, the guy who was the cause of all the commotion dared to come out from behind the bushes. The boy asked in surprise if they really owned the lands here. All our heroes instantly grabbed their swords. Now the stranger understood that, apparently, he had taken a wrong turn somewhere, because getting here was very unpleasant. Looking at the girl, he realized that she most likely had unusual skills, so it seemed that she could easily break his bones. Of course, he threw his dagger on the ground and, smiling sweetly, said that he came in peace. Soon after, he bowed and apologized for dropping in so suddenly. He was simply hungry and had followed the scent. The boys looked back and glanced at the cauldron of soup, and soon they exchanged glances. Our heroine immediately told the stranger that if he did something stupid, she would hang him from a tree. The guy said he understood, and after a while, he was happily devouring a bowl of soup. Meanwhile, the divine animals lay motionless. Lepus suggested they pretend to be toys, and Flea asked what they were. One way or another, the guy soon finished his portion, and, putting the bowl on the ground, he said that it was very tasty, so he was grateful to them. The guy then said his name was Zach, and that he was an A-rank mercenary. He promised to repay them for their kindness. Our heroine glanced at him and asked where he was from. The guy said he was coming from the Portia estate, which was nearby. Zach mentioned that the local forests are very large, making it easy to get lost. He initially had a guide with him, and he also lost his money and compass. Mercenaries. These guys receive requests for a specific type of work. Of course, as a rule, they are hired to kill animals, monsters, or serve as escorts. Our heroine immediately decided that this sounded too stupid. A mercenary who got lost along the way? It was laughable after all. He was an A-rank mercenary, as he said. Also, judging by this guy's belongings, he has been doing this kind of work for a long time, so Espen is sure that he wouldn't allow himself to be robbed by some guide. Zach interrupted Espen's thoughts at that moment, telling her that he thought she was being too wary. Soon after, he asked in surprise where they were heading. Espen, perplexed, asked why he cared. In that case, the guy said he'd tell her. The guy smiled and told them he was heading to the Shua estate. Our heroine, of course, was wary and asked why he was going there. Zach decided to remind her that he was a mercenary and had a job there. It all seemed logical. Nevertheless, our heroine looked at him thoughtfully. Zach asked what was wrong, so he asked them to tell him what was bothering them, and he would help them. Espin said that they were also heading there. However, since they were coming from far away, they knew nothing about these lands. The guy suggested they needed information and he could share it with them. The Shua estate and the surrounding residents were going crazy because of a criminal who was setting fires. As he knew, this attacker was a man of about 30 years old, who first of all sets fire to the forest. Soon after, he happily returns to the city and sets fire to private houses near the estate, and then to the aristocrat's estate. Hearing these words, our heroine was in incredible shock because the fate of her family had literally just been described. The guy said he couldn't catch the criminal, which is why aristocrats recruit mercenaries to protect their estates. Incidentally, he's one of them. Zach said that they had chosen a bad time to travel, so he advised against staying at the estate. Soon after, he looked at Espin and told her that if his instincts were correct, she had some ability with a sword. He offered to take on the job with her, as he was looking for some companions. Our heroine gave him a resounding no. She explained that she was not eager to work with an A-rank mercenary who had managed to lose his wallet and compass. She also added that if everything he told her was a lie, she would certainly not be his friend. The guy laughed, saying it was painful, and apologized. However, it was true that he was hungry and lost. He also assumed that his information wasn't enough to repay them for their delicious meal. The guy soon went on his way and said that he would definitely settle accounts with them the next time they met. Our heroine wondered in surprise what the next meeting meant. There was no reason for them to see each other again. But it turned out they were wrong. The very next morning they were surrounded by knights and, of course, Zach was among them, telling his sister that they had finally met again. Now he asked if they needed his help. Our heroes emerged from the forest and finally arrived at a location near the Shua estate. They had reached the Sorde estate. Standing in line to cross the border, our heroine realized that they had about 3 days' journey left to their destination. The heroes decided to use shape-shifting magic to avoid any problems when entering the estate. Anyway, Katie had an ID card stating that he was a mage's apprentice. Finally reaching the knight to let them through, the man looked at them in bewilderment and issued a ban on crossing the gate. Kate said in bewilderment that, as far as he knew, the photo was taken by presenting an ID, and 2 more people could pass through one at a time. The man said that this was indeed the case, but due to the recent situation, the rules had been changed. Of course, it was about the arsonist, so the knight asked for forgiveness and hoped that they would understand that this was being done for the safety of the estate. As he explained from their rumors, the arsonist could be a magician, and for this reason they carefully check the identity of each person and their identification. The man said he'd like to see the Kade comrades' IDs. Our heroine immediately thought about it. What should she do? She didn't even have any. In turn, Zenak certainly had it, but then everyone would find out about his identity. Looking around, the girl realized with horror that they were going nowhere and this was their final stop. She even considered telling them they were mercenaries escorting Kade. Just at that very moment, another knight approached the captain and began to whisper something in his ear. At that very moment, he shouted and pointed his finger at Espin, ordering the knights to seize her. The girl realized it was too late to say anything. Thus, our heroes were surrounded by a whole bunch of knights and were at a dead end. Our heroine certainly wouldn't want to find herself in such a situation, and everything turned out this way because they were taking so long to respond. As the deputy commander of the knightly heavenly order, she had never found herself in such situations. Looking around, our heroine understood that they were facing ordinary soldiers and that breaking out of the siege would not be difficult, but then they would be classified as arsonists. The captain of the knightly order looked at the suspicious guests and asked them to show their identification. Otherwise, they would take them into custody. Our heroine began to reassure them, telling them they were just ordinary mercenaries. The man then asked to see her mercenary card. After these words, an explosion occurred in Espin's head. What a perfect excuse she'd come up with. What to do now? Now the knights would have even more questions than they already had. Just at that very moment, Espin heard a familiar voice behind her. Turning her head, she saw Zach, who was smiling at her and telling her they were meeting again. He asked if they needed help. After a while, They were standing and talking. The guy laughed at the coincidence that had happened again. Moreover, he didn't even think that he would have the chance to repay them for their help so soon. As soon as Zach noticed his acquaintances, he immediately went to Captain Jacob, telling him that they had not seen each other for a long time, so he asked how he was doing. In any case, the guy turned around and said that the people they had surrounded were his comrades, and they were new. Immediately after this, all the knights began to leave at the captain's command, meaning the problem was over. Of course, Espen accepted the help, but she remained vigilant nonetheless. She never trusted mercenaries. When their emperor fell seriously ill, they did not hire mercenaries to quickly find a magician who could cure his highness. In the end, all these mercenaries turned out to be greedy and avaricious traitors, ready to sell you for pennies. But fortunately, they managed to find an honest mercenary. One way or another, the girl was surprised and could not believe that local aristocrats hired just anyone. Zach felt Espen's piercing gaze all the time, so he said that the way she looked at him made him sad. Our heroine apologized, but she hadn't had the best experience working with mercenaries. The guy sighed and said he understood. Moreover, he added that he himself does not particularly like his colleagues who surround him. It's ironic, but he's actually looking for a traitor right now. Espen asked him again. The guy said the man had stabbed his comrade in the back. However, Zach despises such people, so he is going to take revenge on this freak. Cade suddenly whispered that he had used magic and that the man was telling the truth. Zach suddenly asked them if they had a place to stay. The guy said he knew the city well and also remembered that they were heading to the Shua estate. He added that the security checks there were even stricter than here. But just like here, he can help them at the Shua estate because they can get inside under the guise of his colleagues. After some time, our heroes went to a bar to eat and discuss everything. Zach again reminded his new acquaintances that they needed to get to the Shua estate so they could help him on the way there. Our heroine said that she was grateful to him for his help, but they still had urgent business, and unfortunately, there was no time. Zach said everything was fine, but if they agreed to help, he promised to stay out of their way. Espen said she'd rather get the mercenaries card herself. The guy laughed, saying that it wouldn't be easy, since the guild had temporarily stopped issuing cards because of the arsonist incident. He smiled again and said that he needed help on the road, but once they arrived at the Shua estate, he would say goodbye to them. With a heavy sigh, our heroine realized they had no other choice, so she asked what his purpose was. The boy twisted his head from side to side, and once he was sure there were no extra ears, he said just one word: arsonist. At that very moment, Zach said that the arsonist was actually his comrade. After a while, the action shifted to the bedroom. The others were already asleep, but Espen couldn't stop thinking about the arsonist. The girl immediately wondered if this man had any connection to what had happened to her family. Was he the criminal? With these thoughts, our heroine nevertheless fell onto the pillow, thinking that she needed to get some sleep. The action takes us to another room, namely Zenok's bedroom. He too was awake and wondering why Espen had called him commander. This question constantly swirled around in his head and didn't give him any peace, but at that moment, someone approached him and asked if he couldn't sleep either. As it turned out, that man was Katie, who, oddly enough, hadn't slept that night either, having questions of his own. The guy said he'd like to talk to Zenok. With some disdain, Zenok looked at Katie and told him that he was not interested. The mage asked in surprise if the boy really didn't want to listen to him. Even if it concerned Espen, Zenok, perplexed, asked what that meant. The guy said that he can see that Zenok likes her, but nevertheless, he likes her too. Zenok instantly jumped out of bed, asking her not to make fun of him. He said he was sure Cade was simply using her. The magician glanced at him and said in surprise that he'd never imagined he was so hot-tempered. So, was he just pretending to be so timid? The guy said it was pretty sneaky. Zenok snorted and asked him to speak for himself, since he was the one trying to use Espen. Cade said he really didn't understand what he was talking about, because otherwise he wouldn't be helping them. He also said he wanted to be friends with him. Looking at Zenok, the magician explained to him that if a quarrel arose between them, Espen would be on his side. Zenok looked at Cade in confusion and asked what he wanted to say. He immediately warned him that if he wanted to say anything nasty about Espen, he had only himself to blame. Cade sighed and sat down on the bed, then said he wasn't insulting the woman behind his back. He just wanted to talk about her strength. Didn't he find that unusual? Zinok asked in surprise if he was really talking about her becoming an adult. The guy nodded. Kate told him that Espen had previously explained to him that she had borrowed powers from a divine being, but until now there had been no human who could do such a thing. That is why the magician assumed that it was all about the power of time. At that very moment, Zinok remembered the words of Lepus, who had spoken of some death of Espen. In any case, the guy looked at the magician and asked why he was telling him about this. Kate explained to him that the power of time was dangerous. He didn't know if Espen knew, but using such a power by a human could lead to dire consequences. The guy concluded by saying that Espen could get hurt, so they had to intervene. Soon after these words, Zenok sighed and agreed with the magician, and after some time they went to bed. The action takes us to the next morning. Our heroine, like the other kids, was sitting at the table eating breakfast. The girl also noticed that nothing had passed, but Zenok already looked exhausted. Incidentally, looking at this ordinary meal, our heroine wondered, why did these two look like they'd been friends their whole lives? Or was it just her imagination? One way or another, her thoughts were interrupted by Zach, who also woke up and went downstairs. After a while, they were walking down the street, and Zach asked where they'd come from. Espen said, from far away. It was cold, but she told him he didn't need to know. The guy said, surprised, that they were now friends. So why not be a little friendlier? Espen reminded him that they'd been talking about helping, and they weren't there to get acquainted. Zach thought for a moment and said she was right. They would help him with the arsonist. Incidentally, our heroine asked for more details about him. The guy said there were rumors that the arsonist was a man in his 30s, but that wasn't true. He was a mage, but he was also skilled with a sword, which is why he was called a swordsman mage. Our heroine was surprised by this, as it's a very rare phenomenon. A swordsman is a person who wields both a sword and magic. Zach continued to say that most of the time, the arsonist lives near the sea, and our heroine understood that the criminal was very talented. The guy added that their target was born in the north, and his character is very complex and, moreover, at times he becomes gloomy. At first he acts nice to people, but soon reveals his true colors. While mercenaries are usually bad people, the arsonist goes beyond all bounds. Zach said one of his comrades reported seeing him heading toward the Shua estate. If they don't mind, they should hurry. Thus, our heroes traveled their journey for 3 days, and finally, the Shua estate began to appear before them. They were close. Our heroine looked at her home with sorrow in her soul, thinking that it was only a short distance away, but it didn't matter, because she wouldn't be able to go there and see her parents. At that very moment, her thoughts were interrupted, because at that very moment, lightning struck over the estate. Our heroine, perplexed, asked what it was, and Zach apologized for forgetting to tell her. Lightning was a common occurrence in the estate these days. Espen was nonetheless surprised that lightning was covering the estate on an otherwise clear day. It was very strange. Just then, Lepus announced that it was the power of a divine animal and that it was emitting lightning. Flea happily announced that it was Rika. Lepus also said that, compared to the others, this creature is very dangerous, so she should be careful. He loves lightning and fire and hates people. Meanwhile, the action takes us to the estate, where the maid walked along the corridors and looked for her mistress, not understanding where she could be. Meanwhile, little Espen was sitting under the table, giggling and saying that they couldn't find her. At that very moment, a man looked under the table, saying that he had found her, but the maids were scared. Of course, that man was Count Shua, who picked up his daughter and asked where her mother was. The girl replied that she was in the garden. Approaching the window, the man suggested that his daughter was too bored to spend all her time in the estate. Espen sighed and nodded. The man looked out the window, hoping that the criminal would be caught as soon as possible. Then he said that they called the best mercenaries, and they had to spend a lot of money to hire a magician. Glancing at his daughter, he noticed that Espen was simply looking at him with surprised eyes. Count Shua realized she didn't understand anything at all and laughed. Right after that, he explained to her that as soon as they caught the evil criminal, then they would be able to walk outside as before. Hearing these words, the girl was incredibly happy because it was already more understandable. At that very moment, their conversation was interrupted by someone knocking on the door. Soon the door opened, and the butler, greeting the count, told him that Baron Sahaman had arrived. The man turned around in bewilderment and reminded that he had asked not to be disturbed. Espen looked at her father, who at that moment even scared her a little. Anyway, Count Shua put his daughter down on the ground and told her that she should go to her mother. She immediately ran out of the room, and Baron Sahaman joyfully greeted the Count, asking him how he was doing. The girl ran out into the hallway and seemed to be heading towards her mother at first, but she decided to go into the next room and sit there for a while, because she had an idea. Closing the door behind her, she giggled, thinking about how she could scare her dad like that. At that very moment, a loud cry was heard, indicating that he had said that this shouldn't be done. He was perplexed, saying that this was one of the benefits of having relatives. Count Shua said that if you add up all the money that Sahaman borrowed from him over 10 years, you get the amount of the state budget for 6 months. The man, perplexed, said that he was doing everything for the sake of the estate, so why didn't they believe him? He promised that his idea would only bring profit. However, the Count told him that he had recently learned that Sahaman was addicted to gambling, so he lied about being involved in investments. As he passed the man, he said that if he managed to pay off all his debts, then he should stop gambling. Before closing the door behind him, the Count said that if he made another such request, he would order that he not be allowed into the estate. Espen was very shocked that Dad was so angry that he even slammed the door. Soon she ran to the door of the room where her dad was to see what was going on. In the room, she saw Baron Sahaman, who was incredibly angry. He asked how Count Shua dared speak to him like that. Meanwhile, the action takes us to our heroine, who was standing in front of the estate, of course, looking at her native estate. Images from her childhood, in which she was next to her parents, began to appear in her head. Zenak saw how depressed Espen was about being here, and that made it hard for him too. At that very moment, Zach approached them and said that they had been traveling for several days, but in the end, he still hadn't heard anything about Zenak and Katie. As far as he could tell, one of them was a mage, and the other a swordsman. He asked Zenak what kind of swordsmanship he had, and he hoped he was at least on par with him. Zenak was speechless at that moment, but Espen came up to him and asked Zach not to ask a bunch of questions, because this guy would become the best swordmaster. Putting her hand on his shoulder, she said that she knew he could handle it without any problems, because she believed in him. Zach was delighted because he knows his sister's skills are incredible, so if she has so much confidence in him, he wanted them both to become mercenaries. While Zenak was incredibly red in the face with embarrassment, our heroine told Zach to fuck off and stop annoying her. At this point, she also added that he had never seen her handle a ball before, so she wanted to know how he knew she was good. Zach commented with surprise that not all swordsmen are the same. He was confident in her skills just by looking at her sword, and besides, her gaze speaks volumes. In any case, they now needed to gather information about the arsonist. What did they think about it? Our heroine said that they would work on this task separately. The guy then said goodbye to them and said that they would have to meet here at sunset. Espen, in turn, turned to the boys and said that they must find the divine animal. Our heroine recently noticed that lightning had appeared in the sky again, and she immediately remembered the words of Lepus. The girl suddenly realized that the divine animal's abilities and what the arsonist had done were very similar. Were they connected? She immediately began to think that this could be the reason why the arsonist was in this estate, or perhaps she even considered that it was more complicated, and that the fire was the fault of a divine being. In any case, she would never know. She hoped that Cade and Flea, who had gone out together to look for traces, would find at least something. Sitting on the bench, she thought about how tired she was. There were too many thoughts going through her head at once. At that moment, Zenak approached Espen and told her she looked tired. He wanted to know if she was okay. Putting his hand to her face, he also commented on how red she was. At that moment, Espen couldn't even hear herself think. She sheepishly assured herself that it wasn't him she was blushing at. They needed to finish their business quickly and get back to their old selves. At that moment, when our heroine turned her head, she noticed a strange man who was muttering something under his breath. Looking at him, she realized with horror that she remembered this man because he was her uncle.